Hello, romance lovers. Today's story is called I Have Three Tyrant Brothers. If you enjoy our videos, don't forget to like. It was a country that received protection from an ancient dragon. It was the most Nature created all the conditions for the country's prosperity. A favorable climate, bubbling, full-flowing waters, and fertile black soil. Avascania ruled this country. This family was notorious for its cruelty. It was due to this trait that over the many years of their existence, they have tried in every possible way to protect their right to power. But even among this family, a new generation of princes stood out. They were considered especially outstanding, or in another situation, if suddenly any noble family interferes in the affairs, they immediately arrange a massacre, without distinguishing between the guilty. There was even a widespread rumor in the empire that the princes had stabbed to death the emperors. But despite all their actions and the terrible rumors that filled their empire, the princes seemed perfect. But everything was not so simple, because there was a curse that haunted this entire royal family. A curse that would cause them to die at the hands of someone they loved or loved wholeheartedly. The method of lifting this curse from the imperial family remained untried. It required the birth. Many claimed that this honor belonged to them. Many girls tried to prove their belonging to the. All this happened because they needed to know their place. None of them could confirm their belonging to the genus Ascania. This was quite difficult to do for a person who did not belong to this family. A characteristic feature of all and one of the representatives of this ancient ruling family was now reading a recently received report about the search for his lost relative. The prince decided that he should not delay a second and said that he was going there immediately, in order to thus fulfill the will of his father. He knew he couldn't delay, because perhaps if the information he had received in this message was true, he would be able to. The key to breaking the long-standing curse was supposed to be a little girl who was on the very edge of the empire and was currently hanging out laundry. Her laundry basket was overflowing, and so it was very heavy to carry. But the girl could not. She picked up the basket of damp laundry and headed towards the end of the garden surrounding the. The girl remembered that she had quite a lot of things to do today. She still had to iron the. She moved slowly and kept thinking about what was bothering her. Besides, she was very hungry. The conditions their master kept them in were simply horrible. He only used his slaves without caring about them at all. Their master. The girl thought that perhaps this was her fate. She didn't even know if she would live to. At some point, she heard someone calling her loudly from behind. It was a girl. The girl was very scared when she heard this voice, which, judging by its volume and intonation, did not promise her anything good. The poor slave turned around and gasped when she saw the person pursuing her. They were about the same age, but this naughty girl's name was Miriam. She was mean and cruel, and the other little inhabitants of the house were afraid. The girl looked at her pursuer with fear and expected the worst. She asked her why she suddenly. The master did not think much about the names of his slaves. The girl was a weekday slave whom the master picked up on Wednesday. And this girl. It seemed that Miriam was not at all satisfied with her answer. She did not even think for a second, and the next moment Wednesday felt that palm on her cheek. It hurt after the naughty girl hit her. Miriam ordered her to be silent. She was not going to listen to any excuses and ordered her to cover her mouth and only listen to her orders. Wednesday decided that she shouldn't answer. After all, the best answer to all the complaints would be silence. The girl thought that if she said, unlike her, this girl has a name. Slaves with names are responsible for. The girl understood that therefore she absolutely could not contradict her interlocutor. She said that she remembered this. Miriam still couldn't calm down and seemed to enjoy her power over the poor slave. She asked her if she had forgotten that a slave was not allowed to open his mouth, and added that she could only nod in response. Wednesday decided that she didn't need this conflict to escalate, so she didn't answer. Over the many years of being in this house, she had become accustomed to silently carrying out. The slave with the name poked her in the chest with her finger and said that since she understood everything, she should go and clean up the master's hall and library. When she looked into the slave's face to ask her if she would have time to do all this today, she noticed that there was something wrong with her. Miriam told the girl that just looking at her made her feel worse. She felt bad and therefore she should get out of here immediately. Wednesday decided that she needed to actually carry out her orders as quickly as possible. She grabbed her itchy cheek and her little boss reminded her again that she should not shirk and that she had to get to work as quickly as possible. Otherwise, as she knew, luckily for the girl, she calmed down and went about her business, and Wednesday headed to the place she had been heading to before. The girl carried a heavy basket of laundry and thought about why fate had treated her so cruelly. After all, she was of the same status as her. She wondered if perhaps this angry, loud girl had not always been the way she had become lately. The girl continued her movement, indulging in thoughts about her bitter fate in the slave trader's house. She turned towards the direction from which the noise was coming and saw a boy waving a broom that seemed to be taller than him and sweeping the courtyard of the estate. This boy was familiar to her. He had exactly the same fate as she. He was equal to her, and his stat. When she shouted his name, he stopped sweeping the yard and looked questioningly. Then he recognized his friend and laughed happily back at her, telling her name. They didn't have much joy in their lives, but they always rejoiced when they met each other. The boy began to look closely at the things the slave was carrying. He realized that she was carrying things. He looked closely at his friend standing in front of him and noticed that something was wrong with her cheek. The boy asked her why her cheek was so red. She didn't answer his question, but the boy himself understood everything and now asked her if Miriam had really hit her again. Wednesday didn't know what to answer him. After all, if she told the truth, he would be very angry. And if he tried to take revenge on the naughty girl later, he would have to starve in his room again. The poor little slave decided that it was better not to do this. The best solution. Wednesday decided that it was best to change the subject in this situation so that the boy would forget about his question. And so she answered it with her own question about why he was cleaning here. The boy only sighed after his friend's remark that it was not his turn today. Sunday told her that today was indeed not his day, but he got bored of just sitting in his room. Wednesday realized that he simply had not told her the whole truth, because since today was her day, the girl thought that he was a real friend, always ready to help her and come to the rescue. He was so sweet, but still she told him that he couldn't do that. The boy himself knew that this was so. Children like them are named after one of the days of the week and must perform. Wednesday knew that this was so-called training, so that they would be completely submissive to their master. She was also sure that Sunday told her that he didn't think there was much to worry about today. From what he had heard, it seemed that their master was not feeling well today, and but still, the little slave couldn't agree with him. She felt very sorry for this boy, and Sunday said that she shouldn't worry. Even if they saw him, they wouldn't be able to punish him because they wouldn't catch him. The girl standing opposite him laughed and said that it was completely normal because she was older than him and he was her little brother. The girl remembered that something very strange had been happening to her lately. She often dreamed this world was completely different from the one she was currently in as a slave. There were some rather strange things there. There were no cars in this world, but they were definitely present in her dreams, crossing city streets and rushing at great speed. The girl's life in her dreams was very different from the life that was filled with cruelty and bullying here. There she attended. In that life, the girl and her brother had black hair, and the boy standing in front of her had exactly the same jet black hair. And now he said that he could actually be the older brother. For a moment, Wednesday thought that perhaps he might be right, since none of the slaves knew their own age. But Sunday seemed to be very angry with her words because he shouted loudly. The girl laughed, seeing how funny the boy looked when he got angry. She said that of course. The boy said that when that happened, she would have to call him Big Brother. Wednesday noticed that something seemed wrong with the boy. She asked him if he was okay, and if he had On Sunday, he told her that he was fine and that he felt good. It was just hot here, that's all. Wednesday decided that she probably couldn't refuse this boy's help any longer, so she thanked him for his help. Her friend said that he would definitely do so and clean everything up while she was busy hanging out the laundry. The boy spread his arms wide to show her how strong he was, and shouted that they would see each other later. When Wednesday thanked her friend once again for his help and waved her hand goodbye. The girl finished her work in the garden quite quickly and headed into the house. Then she cleaned the hall and carefully opened the door leading. Then what happened was the last thing she wanted. When Wednesday looked through the library door, she was upset by what she saw inside. Unfortunately for her, their master was there. She didn't want to see this man. Wednesday thought that their master's office was usually empty at this time. She would very much like it to be so this time. But she had no choice. To the little slave's chagrin, she was unable to do so, for the slave trader noticed her and cursed. Thank God his shout had nothing to do with the girl. The owner shouted loudly about why border control had been tightened now, and that he wouldn't. Wednesday tried to move as quietly as possible in the library, holding the broom in her hand. The girl thought that she had done nothing for which she could be punished now. But he immediately turned to his little slave and started shouting at her. He asked her how long ago she had been here and what this useless child was looking at. Her owner immediately swung his hand and struck the girl again on the cheek, which still hurt from the previous blow. Wednesday didn't turn away because if she did, she would get hit more than once. The girl was in great pain, but she remembered that she shouldn't cry and needed to endure. She had learned from the hard life in that ill-fated house. She knew very well that if she cried, her owner called the girl a stubborn girl and noted that she didn't even squeak and asked if she. Then the cruel man shouted at her how dare she ignore her master. She should be grateful to him. Wednesday stood before him, not saying a single word. She remembered that she had to, but without understanding why, the girl suddenly decided to answer this sadist and said that she was not ignoring him. The girl had studied this man well. She had learned to be extremely careful when this man had asked her many times before how she dared to ignore his words. He shouted loudly in her face that she was just Wednesday, a stubborn girl. The girl thought about how much longer she had to endure all this. Then she told the man standing in front of her that the man was literally stunned by her words. He did not expect such an answer and asked the girl if she had. He looked at his little slave and thought that even if he just looked into her eyes, for some reason he immediately felt worse. The slave trader hastened to remind the girl that she was only a slave in this house, and slaves, for her information, were. Then he reached for the whip that lay on his table and said that the death of one slave would go unnoticed. Wednesday knew what was coming. She had been beaten with that whip many times before, so she just bowed her head. Her master began to approach her and said that his little slave lacked devotion to her master. His eyes were full of malice. There was a determination in his gaze to punish this disobedient girl. The girl always knew that her master was a very cruel man. He spared no one and punished for the slightest offense. And now she was sure of her innocence. She was used to being beaten often, and now it seemed there was no fear in her eyes at all. Her cheek, red from the blow, was swollen, but the girl was not afraid. The next moment, the girl fell to her knees in front of the man who was beating her. She thought that she might die here. When Wednesday was already preparing for the next blow from its owner, the library's front door suddenly opened and air from the corridor rushed into the room. The little slave turned towards the open door, completely oblivious to her master waving at her. She wondered who in the house could disturb the most important person. Complete strangers to both the girl and the slave trader burst into the room. They were rather strange-looking. The slave trader said 2 words that surprised the girl very much. This young man was dressed much more elegantly and richly than all the others. The king's knights stood next to him, talking among themselves about how they seemed to have arrived. A young man with blue eyes and straw-colored hair turned to the little slave's owner and ordered him to lay down his arms immediately. The owner of the estate immediately began to sweat heavily and tremble, as if he was very frightened. Stammering, he asked the knights how. He began to wonder who it could be, and suddenly thought that it could not be someone of royal blood, and dropped his whip on the ground. The girl also looked attentively at the young man who was different from his companions. She was interested in who it could be, and she thought that he was so pale and handsome. The young man did not take his eyes off the little girl. He looked at her and stared. He did not take his eyes off the little slave, and then said that she was going to be a blonde. The girl couldn't understand why he was looking at her so intently, and why he cared what color her hair was. One of the knights called this young man His Highness Chester and said that obviously this little girl. Thus the little slave girl knew that the prince was before her, and he answered his companion that he was probably right. But Lady Eric had a very similar hair color to this child. Wednesday continued to look at the young man. She had never seen a real prince in her life, and she was very curious whether princes were different from ordinary people. The slave trader seemed to have come to his senses a little. Even though he was sweating profusely, thoughts were quickly spinning in his mind that this was a prince. He then said that the brat had escaped from the organization, but then, he couldn't finish his sentence because the prince swung his boot hard. The girl watched in horror as the young man beat her master, who addressed him as Your Highness and asked why he was doing this. For a moment, the girl thought the prince's eyes had become a completely different color. He said that he was acting like this only because he had ruined his mood. Wednesday stared into the young man's eyes. She thought that if she was not mistaken, his eyes seemed to have turned black. The prince stood over the slave trader, who said that this was too much even for the crown prince. And besides, it was an attack on private property. The young man almost laughed and said that it was very interesting to hear about it from a criminal. The next moment, the prince pointed his finger at the owner of the house sitting at his feet and announced to him that he was accused of slave trading and selling. He threw the sheets of paper with the verdict in the face of the man accused of the crime. The slave trader grabbed one of the sheets, trying to read what was written on it. The prince informed him that his crime was treason, and as he knew very well, in such a case, the girl watched attentively everything that was happening in her master's library. The prince reported that the punishment adopted since the prohibition of the slave trade in the empire was, at that moment, it was as if her whole life flashed before her in the girl's red eyes. Wednesday thought that living as a slave was no fun at all, and that such a life was just a nightmare, full of violence, where every day the girl remembered the words of the master, which he often repeated to his slaves. He loved to mock his little slaves and often pulled their hair, making them cry. He told them that their lives were worthless. If you try to escape and are caught, you will die. If you refuse to obey, you will die. The girl believed that she could adapt and deprive herself of all feelings. After all, she thought that she could only accept her miserable fate. But all this was forbidden, and she could only hope for some miracle. The prince came closer to the girl and, without taking his eyes off her, told the owner that not only he would be punished, the royal knights immediately began to discuss this. They could not understand how to do this, but were ready to carry. And while the girl was remembering what her life had been like as a slave to this man she hated, the prince seemed to notice the word. Wednesday could not understand what was happening because the young man brought his hand closer to her face. The girl remembered another slave who often mocked her. Very often, she repeated that her eyes irritated this girl. Her eyes were just as hateful to the slave trader. Usually, when he was going to punish, the girl decided that they would probably beat her again because of her eyes. She covered her eyes. When the prince asked her what he couldn't do, the girl said that he couldn't beat her because no one liked her eyes. And she told the young man that everyone was telling her about her ugly eyes, which they could not look into for long, and therefore the prince must have understood what the girl was talking about. He slowly began to stretch his hand towards her. The prince touched her head and began to stroke the girl's crown. He told her she thought he was a nice young man. He tried to talk to her gently and kept stroking her head. And then he said that she wasn't the monster he thought she was. She didn't understand at all what he meant when he called himself a monster. He was not. The prince looked into her eyes and noticed that they were red. Then the young man thought about something. Wednesday thought it was all because of her eyes. She thought the prince would be very irritated by her eyes because at the moment when the girl decided to hide her eyes, the prince asked her if she was afraid of him. The girl immediately began to desperately shake her head, as if denying that she had become scared. Although in fact it was. The prince looked at her closely and decided that, in his opinion, the girl, Wednesday, couldn't understand how this man knew she was scared. She decided that maybe he knew because he just saw. The prince continued to sit next to her and smiled, seeing the confusion in the little girl's eyes. After some time, a young man approached them and handed a small soft toy into the prince's hands. The prince held out a small stuffed puppy towards the girl and told her that he was giving it to her as an apology. Wednesday took this toy in her hands and was surprised to notice that it was so cute and soft. The girl immediately began to justify herself and, as an apology, said that after that, she started crying again for some reason and tried to give the toy back. She thanked him for it, but said that at the moment she said these words, something strange happened. It was as if the girl's eyes began to. The girl looked into the eyes of the young man who remained sitting next to her and noticed that for some reason his eyes had also changed. Wednesday noticed that along with the change in the prince's mood, the color of his eyes also changed. Now he looked at her with yellow eyes. The royal knights were stunned, they saw. They noticed that the eyes of their masters and the eyes of the little girl had changed color, and they thought that this could not. The slave trader was still kneeling on the floor of his library. He kept repeating just one word. The prince told the girl that he had finally found her and called her the ray of light of the Ascania family. It was this girl who was the only one who would break the curse and save the Sad family. a unique creation. The little girl listened with fear and surprise to the young man who had just called her Princess Ascania. The prince stood in front of the girl, looked at her, and again called her princess, and then said that she was his sister. This young man was smiling all the time. His eyes changed back to blue when he told the girl that Wednesday was very surprised. She still could not understand what was happening. She did not understand why this young man called her his sister. Then, when the prince became silent, she began to worry a little, thinking that perhaps she had done. The young man noticed that the girl seemed to be shivering a little. He leaned over to her. Wednesday replied that she was not frozen and was not cold at all. The young man asked her why her face was so red then. Wednesday immediately remembered how she had been hit on this cheek and grabbed her cheek, which was swollen from the blow, with her hand. She began to think about whether she should tell the prince the truth about where the red marks on her. When the girl looked at this cruel man, she noticed that he was also impatiently waiting for her answer. It seemed to her that his eyes even grew. The prince looked in the direction where his little sister was looking, and he must have guessed everything, because he told her that he understood everything. The slave trader immediately began to make excuses, asking them to wait a little, and said that it was simply worth understanding him, but the prince did not want to understand anything. He stood up from his place and began to move towards the owner of the house. He came close to the man kneeling before him and demanded an explanation of what had happened. The boy's eyes gleamed with a predatory gleam, and he told the slaver that before he reported his crimes, he wanted to ask him one question. And he asked him what the child's. The young man's voice grew more and more stern. He turned to the slave trader again and asked him when his little sister's colors had changed to red. Wednesday was very interested in the topic of this conversation. She could not believe that her eyes were changing color. Her owner immediately began to justify himself and said that her eyes were definitely blue. But then they changed color when the prince knew well that red symbolized a threat. Every time those eyes looked at him, the master felt uneasy. When the slave trader told the prince that the emperor's family had never produced girls, the girl was surprised by the words of the prince, who said that there is a belief. If a girl is born into the imperial family, it means that the curse has lifted. After the prince told him that 10 years ago, one of the emperor's concubines had given birth to an heiress, the slave trader, hearing his words, the prince immediately grabbed the hilt of his sword, wanting to snatch it from its sheath, and said that changing the color of the eyes depending. It seemed that the young man was ready to kill this man. His sword was already completely naked. Wednesday, who was watching the scene unfold before her, began to tremble with fear. She did not, but then she felt some cloth touch her face. It was one of the royal knights who decided to cover her. The same young man turned to his majesty and said that the girl had seen too much of the deed. The princess was still very young, and she should not see anything like that. He covered the little slave with his cloak and held her by the shoulders. At this time, Wednesday continued to tremble with fear. The prince turned to the young man, calling him by his name, Colin. The youth then turned to another knight, whose name was Gadon, and said that the slave trader had fainted and must be. The knight replied that he would immediately begin to carry out his master's order. He grabbed the owner of the house by the hair and dragged him along. The slave trader quickly came to his senses, and when he found himself in the corridor, the man was kneeling again, and His Majesty the Prince stood over him with a drawn sword. The prince repeated the word he had said, raised, and then told them. The master of the house began to scream loudly when the prince's sword almost touched his chest at the base of his neck. He asked for forgiveness. The knight standing next to the prince asked him what was bothering him. The young man did not answer his knight's question. He turned around, sheathed his sword, and ordered the slaver to be left alive. The only word that came out of the surprised knight's mouth was, "What?" He still could not believe such a decision of the prince, who was known for his speed in carrying out punishments. The knight wondered if the crown prince had decided to show compassion. to treat the man's life as if the knight thought that he must have been mistaken. His master's words showed that he was very angry with this man and wanted to punish him as severely as the prince began to walk away towards the library door, and his knight could not shake the thought that the look the prince had given the slave trader was like an icy blue flame piercing to the bone. All the time the prince spent talking to the slave trader and his knights, the little slave girl remained covered. She did not let go of her little friend, with whom she had already managed to become friends during this time. The footsteps came closer and closer to the little slave, and finally someone stopped in front of her. He looked closely at the girl standing in front of her and thought that such a weak and cute child, his only younger sister, whose eyes were now green, and this greatly worried the young man. The prince sat down next to his little sister and thought that green eyes could only mean one thing. It meant that the girl was worried about something. Those with Ascania blood in their veins can change the color of their eyes depending on the emotions, but when a person is angry, these eyes become black. Eye color turns amber when their owner feels happy. Red eyes indicate that the person with this color feels fear or sadness. Purple eyes indicate that their owner is very delighted with something at that moment. And green color appears in the eyes of a member of their family and now when the prince looked into the eyes of the girl standing in front of him, he noticed the prince looked at the little girl's face and felt very sorry for her. The young man also wanted to somehow cheer her up and calm her down. He said, then the young man extended his hand to her, decided to stroke the girl's head again and thus calm her down. The girl felt her brother's hand touch her head, and it was a new sensation for her. Wednesday really liked what was happening to her now. She enjoyed her brother's touch. The crown prince continued to stroke his little sister's head. At the same time, he smiled at her and said that besides the young man standing before her, there were two others who were waiting for her in the capital. Wednesday couldn't believe her ears when she heard from the prince that the time had come for her to return home. The prince touched her cheek and began to stroke it lightly. He asked the girl not to worry about anything. Wednesday lifted her head up to see the face of the crown prince. She thought that this was her home, the home in which she had spent her entire— The girl still did not understand why these people continued to call her a princess. This word literally stunned the girl. She heard it for the first time and could not understand what— It seems that one of the royal knights understood this, because he told the crown prince that in his opinion, the feeling of affection— The prince merely repeated the end of the young man's sentence. He said Wednesday began to worry that something might go wrong. She was afraid that she might be considered empty-headed because of her ignorance, and that she might end— The thoughts of all those present in the library were interrupted by one of the young men who turned to His Highness and said that if he did not mind, he would like to— The crown prince agreed with him. He noticed that his conversation with the girl had not changed anything. The knight approached the girl and greeted her. He told her that his name was Colin and that he was very pleased to meet the princess. The girl didn't know what to answer him, but she had some strange feeling that she wasn't nervous at all next to this man. And after a very short pause, Wednesday said the word hello to this knight. The knight was very happy after they heard at least one word from the little slave girl. He turned to the crown. At this moment, his master, the crown prince of Chester Ascania, learned the lesson of listening to his vassals. The knight leaned towards the girl. I continued to smile at her. He told the princess that she did not need to be afraid. The girl answered him that she was not afraid of anything, and she was not afraid at all. Then Wednesday seemed to think about something and said to the young man standing in front of her— Colin leaned towards the girl again and said that she was a princess, and henceforth everyone would call her that. The crown prince, standing a little to the side from the young man and girl who were talking, said that she was indeed a princess, and that she was the one who could lift the curse from their family. The prince reiterated that she was rightfully a princess and his younger sister. It was this child who could save the entire royal family. Wednesday was still shocked by his words and could not believe it. She thought, she was the one who was a slave for as long as she could remember. And now her master often told her that her brand was a work of art. He said that the little girl only hugged her only toy in her life tighter with both hands. She couldn't and then Wednesday repeated what she had said many times before. She told the knight who had crouched before her that she was simply Wednesday, and not some princess. A moment later, everyone heard a loud cry from the young man, who shouted that it could not be that Wednesday was a princess. Another knight was surprised by the girl's words. He said that perhaps she loved this day of the week, and that is why she called herself Wednesday. While they were talking, another of the prince's knights entered the library. Seeing this boy dangling in the knight's arms, the little slave girl immediately screamed, calling this boy by his name, Sunday. The boy immediately raised his head, saw his girlfriend, and shouted loudly, addressing the young men, asking what they were doing with Wednesday. The girl and the knight standing nearby began to watch what was happening. The knight continued to hold the boy in such a way that he was as far away from him as possible. He asked the prince for forgiveness for being late and said that this naughty child was quite quick. The crown prince began to look at the floundering boy and became curious as to why the boy and girl were calling themselves by such strange names. It seemed that the fidgety boy had tired his escort enough. He was already out of breath and told the prince that it was not even worth. The next moment, the boy did what he had been waiting for so long. He broke free from his guard's hands, kicking him in the stomach, and quickly ran towards his girlfriend. Sunday ran up to the girl, grabbed her by the head, and began to ask if she was okay and not hurt. Sunday continued to hold the girl's head in his hands and peered closely into her face. For some reason, it seemed that the boy began to worry. He thought that these people could do something to the girl and he could not protect her from. But Wednesday only laughed at her friend's distress. She grabbed his hands and told him that she was fine and that he had absolutely nothing to worry about. Sunday finally realized what was wrong with the girl. He screamed loudly when one of the knights tried to pull him away from the little slave and shouted. Wednesday pointed her finger at one of her eyes and thought that perhaps the boy was talking about the fact that her eye color had changed. The boy continued to scream, saying that the girl's eyes had become completely different. The knight holding him, this young man said that for having encroached on the health of the king's knight, he would certainly face inevitable punishment. The knight standing next to him, who had brought the boy to the library, said that the boy could definitely hit again because he seemed to be no timid person. The little slave girl, who still couldn't accept the role of a princess, was now standing in front of the same knight. Perhaps this knight did not quite understand that they had already found their princess, because he said their crown prince was watching this from the side. The young man decided not to interfere for now, deciding that the royal knight— That's exactly what happened, as the prince thought. One of the knights approached his— It seems that their master, the prince, decided to intervene and called to him a knight named His, who had recently— His immediately turned around, expecting that now some kind of punish— Sunday told the same knight that he looked like a rich snob, and what did he want from Wednesday? The boy swung his arm to strike the young man standing in front of him. He seemed determined to protect his girlfriend. He shouted loudly that he would not let this go unnoticed. The prince did not respond to his threats, but simply asked the boy why he named this girl. The boy knew this well from birth. When he arrived in this house, he too was given the names. The crown prince thought about his answer. The young man repeated Slave's Day loudly once more, wondering what it might mean, and then asked both children. The little girl decided to explain what this meant and said that every young slave in this house had a corresponding name. The boy standing in front of him was silent, and the girl said that they were assigned one day of education, and they had to do the assigned work. When she finished her story, she nervously stroked her soft friend with her hand. This is all so that It seemed to her that the young man did not like her answer. He repeated once more. Everyone present in the library noticed that the crown prince's gaze had changed completely. His face had become stern and seemed to have sharpened at the corners. And he himself— The young man reflected on the fact that this carrion was really mocking the poor little children. Wednesday watched the young man standing opposite her with fear. She noticed that his eye— The knight standing next to her looked at the girl and took her hand. He said that— Wednesday told him again that she was not a princess. She was told that she was born a slave because her mother was a slave, and therefore The prince immediately responded to his words and told her that the man who gave life to the little girl was not a slave, and therefore he told the girl that her mother, even in the capital, was a respectable, high-ranking lady. Wednesday thought that this couldn't be true. She couldn't believe that her mother was a noblewoman. She didn't believe that such a thing was possible and decided that they were definitely not telling her. Her little friend intervened in their conversation. He said that then perhaps Wednesday was all. Colin leaned over to the boy standing next to him and explained that his friend was not just a noble. She was the sister of the crown prince standing before him and was a princess herself. The boy was told that she was the princess of Ascania, but he began to loudly protest, saying that the girl had always been just a slave, like him, and perhaps they had confused her with someone else. The crown prince answered his question. He walked up to the girl, put his arm around her. The boy immediately began to remember what Wednesday's eyes had looked like the entire time. Then he thought that when he arrived, he noticed that something was wrong with the girl. And indeed, he began to remember that the girl's eyes seemed to have turned green. His guess was confirmed by the prince, who sat down next to his sister. It was a truth that could not be denied. To this day, there are girls who claim to be part of the imperial family. Many girls claimed their right to belong to their lineage. Each one. This time, Wednesday seemed to understand what was going on. She asked about the fact that these girls were probably not. Her brother, who sat down next to her, said that she was absolutely right. He looked at this girl and was convinced that she had mysterious eyes, the owners of which could only be members of the imperial family. Her mother was from a noble family. At that moment, the girl remembered her life in that damned house. It was very difficult for her. Wednesday kept thinking that it looked simply unbelievable and couldn't believe that it was all true. She thought that if she was so important to these people, then why did they? It seemed that the same thought had just occurred to her little friend. He asked the prince and the knights. The boy began to scream, addressing these young men, asking where they had been all this time, and whether they had any idea how much she had suffered. One of the knights thought that this child was right, although he was so ignorant, but they had to accept his words. One could understand the indignation of this little child. The crown prince turned his head towards Sunday and asked him what right he had to ask him such questions. Wednesday didn't remain silent either. She quietly told the prince that she was also interested in this and asked why they had come for her only now. Her elder brother replied that he thought it would be wiser to tell her everything slowly when they had already reached the palace. It seems that this surprised the girl even more, because according to the prince, it turns out that she still has a father, who will probably be waiting for her in the palace. Wednesday kept repeating the word father in her head. She couldn't even think about She looked at her little friend and thought again that everything that had happened to her today did not seem true. The prince answered the question of the boy standing before him, whether they were taking his friend with them. He replied that the boy looked at the crown prince's face without hesitation and said that they should take him along with them. He promised that he would do anything. For some reason, Wednesday was very scared for her friend. She screamed loudly and asked the boy what he was. Sunday answered her that if she left, he would definitely follow her, no matter where. The prince listened attentively to the conversation of the little children. He seemed interested in the fact that they were ready to stand up for each other. One of the knights told the boy that he had no need to worry now. After their master was punished, all the slaves. Another knight added that he could now be completely free to do whatever he wanted, but the boy still wouldn't calm down. He shouted loudly that he had already decided everything for himself and was going to protect Wednesday. The knight immediately became upset and said that this rude boy had not only painfully injured his legs, but had now also rudely interrupted him. The boy screamed only one thing. He loudly demanded to be taken with them. The prince seemed to have made some decision. He quietly repeated the boy's words about being ready to protect the girl. He liked the fact that the boy was. After this, the crown prince grabbed the hilt of his sword and began to slowly draw it from its sheath. The prince's next move was quite fast. He drew his sword and pointed it forward. The tip of the knife was aimed at the. Sunday didn't even move. He began to tremble a little, but he didn't move a millimeter from his. Wednesday was afraid that something terrible might happen. She was afraid that the little boy might be severely punished for his disobedience, and so she shouted loudly, "No!" She ran forward, not letting go of the small, soft puppy in her hand. The girl held him by the ear, and Wednesday didn't see someone's hand reaching out after her to grab the girl and stop her. Colin managed to do it. He grabbed the princess by the shoulder and asked her to stop and wait a little. The girl thought of only one thing. All her thoughts were about her little friend, who always protected her and helped her in difficult times. She demanded that the knight let her go. Wednesday remembered that she had a great time with this boy. They always supported and consoled each other, and went through all the punishment. Wednesday knew that he was her only friend. She would never be able to forgive herself if anything happened to him. Sunday noticed that there was some movement near him. The boy turned his eye in that direction, trying to see what had happened there. The boy then turned his head towards her and laughed, despite the prince's sharp sword being next to his head. He told her that everything was fine and that she should not worry. The crown prince watched the boy standing before him carefully. He was amazed that the boy was not at all afraid of the sword pointed at him. And at the same time, after a few moments, the sword in the boy's hand began to slowly descend towards the floor. He changed his mind about punishing this little boy and decided that it could be used in some. Sunday turned his head towards the prince and noticed that he had completely changed his mind and lowered his sword down. The crown prince told the boy that what he had told him was not enough to show his determination, and he should also remember well that thoughtless words could lead to immediate death. On Sunday, he immediately replied that he always keeps his promises to anyone. Never in his life had it been different with him, and he was ready to do everything in his power for Wednesday. Wednesday listened attentively to this boy. He said that he would always remember how she once saved his life. The boy simply demanded that he too be taken with them to the capital. When he saw that the boy was full of determination. His eyes said that he was no longer a boy. He had experienced a lot in his life and had become an adult who was ready to answer for his words. The crown prince watched the boy closely. He did not fail to notice that the boy's voice, while the young man thought that the boy's gaze was full of determination and that he would not do any harm to his sister, this little girl broke free from the arms of the knight who was holding her and ran towards the boy, shouting his name loudly. Wednesday ran up to the boy, began to feel him and asked if he was okay and if he was hurt. The boy replied that after this, the girl turned her head towards the crown prince and seemed to silently ask him what he had decided to do. Prince Ascania sheathed his sword and ordered everyone to prepare to return to the palace. His was very upset by the prince's order that he be the one to take care of the black-haired boy. He began to grimace and cry and reminded the prince that his legs still hurt. The little friends stood opposite each other and looked in surprise at the crying man, who had probably never experienced as much. The girl looked at the crown prince and thought that she still had to rethink everything that had just happened. Sunday had almost gotten into trouble, and her older brother, the young man, left the library and his royal knights followed him. Wednesday decided that the prince seemed to be a rather terrible and cruel man. At first, she thought he was a beautiful and bright person. However, the prince and his knights quickly prepared for the journey. They took their princess with them, and by evening they had ridden quite far from the estate, where the crown prince was still deep in thought, sitting by the open fire, when the knight approached the prince and said that, thank God, he had found him. Prince Ascania turned his head in his direction and said just one word, "Child." The knight hastened to reply that the noisy child who had followed the princess would be taken as a servant. But the crown prince immediately cut him off and said that he was not interested in this boy, and that he was talking about his sister. The knight realized that he was mistaken and told the prince that he was talking about the princess. He told the young man that the princess was now sleeping in the carriage. After a hard day, Chester immediately asked his interlocutor if the girl had asked for anything. The knight replied that perhaps she was uncomfortable because of the nervous journey, but she did not ask for anything and did not say anything. After that, the young man said that the princess also said that she could not be in such a luxurious carriage alone. The prince was very surprised by his words. He asked if she really said that she could not be in such a The prince stood up from his seat and walked towards the carriage. He thought that this old carriage was only there to confuse the rest of the people. It was a rather old and battered vehicle that had traveled all over the empire over the years. It was chosen so as not. The young man looked at the carriage again and noticed that it was quite old and worn out. He thought that the girl would say that this carriage did not suit her, but it turned out that in her eyes it looked luxurious. The prince began to wonder what she found luxurious in this carriage. He thought that the princess was a very meek child and modest at that. The knight accompanying the princess also said that the girl was behaving surprisingly decently. The prince remembered how long he had spent searching the empire for his missing sister. All searches had been unsuccessful. He often asked girls who appeared in the palace whether they were his sister, and then ordered her to be taken out of the palace. Very often, girls who had to be literally forcibly removed from the room would throw tantrums and scream about being a princess and asking not to be thrown out. The prince remembered standing at the window, wondering who these girls were. He had seen hundreds of them before that. Finding this girl was vital, because the curse of the imperial family, that only a girl born into their family could break, would never. The young man believed that their family would be forever damned. However, when about 6 months ago, the emperor, unable to leave the battlefield, sent a Chester, having received instructions from his father, immediately became familiar with them. During the investigation, he had to review a lot of documents. He looked everywhere for clues about his younger sister, whose existence was generally questionable. Finally, after letters had been received from all over the empire, it seemed to him that he had finally found the right thread to grasp. He remembered that when he told this little child that she was a princess, she immediately began to deny everything and said that her name was Wednesday, and she was not a princess at all. He remembered his conversation with his little sister and realized that she really was different from many. The prince remembered how sad his little sister's face was when he first met her. It seemed that her life was filled with nothing but sadness and suffering. Chester thought that the worst thing that could happen to his sister, and that only he could imagine. The knight standing next to him thought that perhaps the atmosphere was getting tense. And while the young man was thinking about the fact that his master's eyes had changed color again, the prince closed his eyes and decided that he needed to calm down, because everything that was in the past remained in the past. After this, the prince opened his eyes and asked how His Majesty was. His father was on a military campaign at the time, and news from him did not come very often. The knight replied that a messenger had just been sent to the emperor. By the time they reached the palace, a reply from their master should have arrived. The young man thought again. He thought that it would be very good if the letter from his father were received before he arrived with his little sister at the palace for the first time. It would be a real surprise for her. The knight decided to tell his master something else and informed him that, by the way, The prince thought for a moment and replied that everything was clear to him. His brother's actions were understandable to him, and there was no need to pay special attention to them for now. The young man sat down by the fire again and thought that there was nothing more important now than his sister, whom he had finally managed to find. All his actions had to be subordinated only to the peace and well-being of this child. Colin said that in any case, he was very glad that they managed to find the princess safe and sound. She is a real princess and seems very sensible. The crown prince immediately agreed with him and said that, thank God, they managed to find this unfortunate child. He thought that the girl even resembled her mother, Lady Eric A. And this resemblance was not only. The young man remembered that the girl's mother was a beautiful woman, and for some reason he was sure that the princess sleeping in the carriage would be just as But then he seemed to think again and said no. It would still be better if this did not happen. The prince moved a little away from the burning hearth. His faithful knight also went with him, who decided to discuss something else with him. The young man was busy remembering what had happened in his family's life, it seemed, not so long ago. The little princess's mother was the emperor. This woman was beautiful and wise. She enjoyed a good reputation among the population, the capital, and the entire. Sometimes it happens that the woman at the throne is much more important than the throne and the emperor. This situation is risky for this. The situation of this woman is especially risky when she is pregnant and expecting a girl. The same thing, unfortunately, happened to the mother of the little princess. She was slandered by envious courtiers whose behavior contributed to her inglorious end. These people envied her because the birth of a future child would mean her new status as the first. They could not allow this girl to rise because all the high-ranking officials wanted to see their daughter as empress. These people, who were constantly hanging around and causing mischief at the emperor's court, the prince noticed that the mother of the little princess, whom he had only met today, was very similar to her. And, unlike the girl who had suffered all her life, but then something terrible happened. This woman was sacrificed to political intrigue. The young man thought that the curse of their family had made things even more difficult. That was why the daughter of the emperor's favorite was kidnapped by slave trade. The prince remembered the eyes of the little girl, who looked at him with interest and waited. The prince could not calm down, and all his thoughts were occupied with how to explain all this to a small child. The prince sat and thought. The knight standing next to him thought that it was hard for him to believe that His Highness the Prince could be so. He remembered how lovingly the young man looked at his little sister. He was sure that after all, the young man remembered that this girl also behaved like a real princess. She had natural. Colin felt very sorry for his master, and he decided that he had to change the subject. That is why he turned to the prince. He also said that he had heard from someone that their emperor was desperate to leave the battlefield to meet his long-lost daughter. The prince replied to his knight that if his father were not currently at war, he would definitely come to see his little daughter. The prince seemed to remember something and jumped up from his seat. He also told the knight that if this was so, then there would not be a blade of grass left on that land because the emperor would be in a hurry to return. The prince thought that this was a rather simple solution to their problem. He told himself mentally that in that case, he too would burn everything. The young man stopped at the edge of a forest clearing and looked up at the sky, where a strong flame was visible somewhere. The prince also thought that the emperor did not need to know that he had ordered the slave trader's estate. The prince turned and began to walk toward the carriage. He was comforted by the thought that he had done the right thing in avenging. The young man remembered how, just before leaving this estate, he called to himself one of the knights who was supposed to stay there for a short time. He did not hesitate for a second. The decision had already been made, and he ordered the man. When he told the knight that the child trade must never happen again in their land, he bowed, and very quickly the prince, who did not want to sleep at all, despite the fact that it was already deep night, approached. He extended his hand towards the carriage door, intending to see with his own eyes that the little princess was okay. Chester entered the carriage and stopped, looking at his little sister lying in the carriage. Nothing disturbed her peaceful sleep, and she was now absolutely calm. The prince was surprised to see that the girl had not let go of the toy he had given her. And now she had laid down in such a way that looking at the love his little sister had for this simple toy, he thought that he could give her thousands of such toys. And the prince took his hand and the toy and lifted it up, then placed it on the girl's body. Then he gently lifted the girl into his arms and decided to place her as comfortably as possible on the seat in the carriage. He picked up the toy again and began to examine it. He could not believe that with such a simple gift he could satisfy this little girl. When he put the toy back in place, the little princess immediately grabbed it with her arm. The prince was very pleased that his search had been successful, and he had been able to satisfy his father's wish. Smiling, he looked at the girl lying before him. He was ready to shower this girl with all sorts of gifts. She could have beautiful dolls. The prince thought that this was not all. After all, the most important thing he had to give his sister was something that could not be bought or exchanged. He covered the girl with the cloak he had taken off his shoulders and mentally told her that she just needed to. Chester thought that as soon as they arrived in the capital, he would need to immediately make sure that the gift intended for his little sister was already waiting for her. The young man looked again with satisfaction at the little girl lying in the carriage. The princess was still asleep, but for some reason she felt so good, as she had never felt before. She felt warmth spreading throughout her entire body. In the house where she was a slave, the girl was forced to sleep on bare boards. But now she felt very cozy. She felt so soft and comfortable. Next to her lay her little puppy, who kept her warm with his warm, soft body all night. Wednesday opened her eyes and looked up. She was lying in the carriage and was at first very confused because she did not know where she was now. The girl began to look at the ceiling and walls of this room in surprise, trying to understand. After that, she remembered that yesterday she had fallen asleep in this carriage. She heard voices coming from outside, saying that since they had found the princess, it was a couple of knights from the royal guard who were standing near her carriage, talking to each other. One of them said that it was very. Wednesday remembered all the conversations of yesterday. The words of the knights and the prince about her being a princess were etched into her memory. Then she noticed that she was not in the place where she had fallen asleep. The girl was also surprised that her new friend was next to her. She wondered who came and left. The little princess's thoughts were interrupted by one of the knights who accompanied them on the road. The girl replied that she was fine and had slept better than she had ever slept in her life. At the moment she stood up, the prince's coat, which had covered the girl during the night, flew off her feet and ended up lying on the floor. The girl looked at the clothes lying at her feet and realized that it was a red cloak that belonged to His Highness. Of all the people who came to the slave trader's estate, only the prince had such clothes. When Colin asked the princess if something was wrong, she nervously turned her head in his direction and replied that the girl didn't know what to do. She was confused after her discovery and wondered if the prince had simply forgotten his cloak here. She decided that she should be careful and under no circumstances step on the crown prince's clothes. When the princess opened the carriage door fully to step outside, a knight was already waiting for her, knocking on the door. He greeted her and wished her a good day. The princess answered him, "Good morning, Colin." It still seemed unusual to her to greet each other like this in the morning. The young man immediately thanked her for wishing her a good morning and began to tell her what they were expecting for breakfast that day. He looked inside the carriage and was surprised to see a cloak lying there that belonged to his master. He immediately hurried to ask the girl why. The little princess told him that when she woke up, she noticed that she was covered with a cloak. She thought that perhaps she had done something wrong and became a little worried. Colin was worried because he had not seen His Highness in the morning. He could not understand where he had spent the night and whether he had frozen at night without his cloak. Then the knight was called by his comrades. He turned towards them and noticed the crown prince sitting next to them. The knights. Colin even smiled when he realized what had happened that night. He couldn't believe that their master had No one who knew the prince would ever believe it. He would definitely be called a liar. The knight thought that if he ever decided to tell their acquaintances in the capital about this, they would laugh at him and would never believe that the prince was capable of such actions. When the knight approached the seated prince, he said that apparently His Highness had covered the princess. The princess looked at the cloak lying in the carriage and began to think what to do. She said that she accidentally knocked the cloak. The knight who was accompanying her immediately turned to her and said that her worries were not worth the incident. In his opinion, he laughed and reassured the girl, saying that everything was fine. The princess, who had been used to being punished for any reason before, could not believe the words of this young man. In the past, she was often punished even for things she had not done. She still didn't believe his words, and so asked again if nothing would really happen to her if she stepped on the prince's cloak. The young man laughed and said that of course it was. The prince would certainly not be angry with his sister. The princess would never have thought of doing anything like that, and so she immediately told the young man that she would never do it. The knight laughed and thought that children were so cute. He told the girl that, as he thought, she was very. When the girl asked why the boy's younger brother was acting this way, he replied that he always does in such cases. The little princess couldn't believe that even after such antics, no one scolded these children. If she had done something like that, she would probably have been left without food. The young man explained to her that in their family it was not customary to punish children severely. Of course, they were scolded, and quite rightly, but in no case were they forbidden to continue doing something similar. Now the little princess understood that there was a punishment after all, because they were scolded after all. But then the girl was very surprised when this knight told her that if the princess did something like this, there would be no. Colin even asked her to do such pranks and not to worry even if she did something more serious. When the young man said that he thought he would not be mistaken if he assumed that His Majesty the Emperor and their Highnesses. The knight's next question took the girl by surprise. When he asked if she wanted breakfast, she liked this royal knight very much. He was very friendly and tried to talk to her very politely. And now he asked if she should bring her little friend too. The girl was taken aback by his proposal. She could not understand who the young man was talking about. Who was this mysterious little friend of hers? But then, it seemed she understood everything, because all the time he was in her arms, and now she was hugging him too. The princess thought that she had better leave her soft puppy inside the carriage. When the knight stretched out his hands to her, the girl became very frightened and immediately turned away from him with the desire to run away somewhere far. But then she realized that he was not threatening her in any way. Colin came up to her, hugged her around. The young man picked up the little girl and then lowered her to the ground. Her little plush friend was still hanging in her hand. When the knight had seated the princess at the table, he asked her if she needed anything. And when she answered in the negative, he said that if she needed anything, she should let him know. The girl sat down on a wooden chair and food was placed on the table in front of her. She thought that for the first time in her life, she was seeing fresh white bread. The girl sat and looked at the bowl of soup in front of her. She couldn't believe that she could actually eat something like that. She felt happy that for the first time in her life, someone cared about her. The girl thought that she would not be able to eat her first piece of meat with sufficient civility, and so she did. One of the cooks immediately began to blame himself, saying that his culinary skills were also terrible. But the girl immediately calmed him down and said that it was very tasty. A knight came up to her and said that he would probably have to support her little friend for now. He promised to take care of him while she was busy eating. Colin laughed again and said that if the princess needed anything, she should definitely let them know. The young man sat the girl's toy on a nearby chair and told the princess that her friend would be comfortable there. He asked the girl to eat everything, and if she didn't like the food, then he fell silent and seemed sad. He thought that the princess needed to eat more than yesterday. The princess took a mouthful of food and began to chew it with difficulty. She thought she was already full, but since seeing all this, the knight became cheerful. He was glad that the princess seemed to eat more than usual. And although the girl had difficulty eating, after some time she said that she was already full. The knight stayed with her the whole time and watched her eat. He thought he couldn't make the princess eat it all, but thank the gods, her plate was empty. Colin took the plate from the table and told the princess that his younger brother would have eaten at least 10 more. The girl couldn't believe what she heard. It was hard to believe that a small child could eat so much, and so she asked. The knight held the empty plate in his hands and thought that it was very good that it was empty. The young man was very happy when he heard the little girl's voice. He thought that this was the first time the princess had asked him a question. Colin laughed and began to tell how boys the same age as the princess eat a lot. In fact, this is his fourth brother. The girl remembered that this young man told her that he had 4 younger brothers and 2 younger sisters. He was probably very happy to. The knight decided to tell her as much as he could about his family. He said that his younger brothers got into trouble. Hearing this, the girl for some reason immediately became sad. She was puzzled by the word boys that she heard from the knight and immediately remembered the boy who was dearer to her than anyone else in the world. The princess remembered that when they left the slave trader's house, one of the knights stayed behind to finish business, and her friend named Sunday was forced to stay with him. When the knight asked her if she was worried about anything, the girl replied that she was a little worried about her friend and asked if it was true that Sunday would return. The girl began to worry a little, but her interlocutor immediately hastened to calm her down. Colin said that in any case, she shouldn't worry about anything. Worry! They should arrive in the capital within a month, but perhaps The princess immediately calmed down. This knight had never deceived her before, and so she decided that this time he was telling the truth, and her friend must really be okay. The girl hugged her new little friend tightly to her face and began to hope that she would see her other friend named Sunday. Colin came up to her again, finishing clearing the table after breakfast. He told her that, by the way, if they set out now, the princess did not know what to answer him. She dreamily raised her eyes upward and began to examine the sky and the treetop. The girl remembered that Colin told her that there would be a lot of delicious food there. She also thought about the fact that she would meet her other brothers. She was very curious. She remembered her brother's face when he pointed his sword at her little friend. After that, she remembered Sunday's face when the sword was pointed at him. The boy was very brave and was not afraid of anything. She was very afraid that the other brothers might be exactly the same. The girl closed her eyes in fear and began to hope that Colin noticed that something seemed wrong with her and asked if she was okay. The princess couldn't understand why His Highness the Prince was so angry with her little friend. But when she thought about what the prince had done for her, as they set off, the girl kept looking out the window to see the surroundings. She looked around the whole way, and everything surprised her very much. They drove through very beautiful places, but what impressed the girl most was the huge bridge towering over a turbulent river with The girl was forced to take her place in the carriage again after the knight accompanying her asked her to be more careful. He rode alongside the carriage on horseback and told her that she might get hurt if she leaned on the door like that. The princess agreed with him and promised to be more careful in the future. She looked out the window again and was fascinated by the large building that was already visible from here. The girl smiled sweetly, thinking that her journey was coming to an end. She, as before, then the princess suddenly remembered her little friend who was sitting next to her. He was probably bored, and so she asked his forgiveness for gazing at such beauty. She grabbed her stuffed puppy and sat it on her lap. Then, after this, the princess lifted the puppy in her arms to the window and said that he should see this beauty with his own eyes. When their carriage suddenly stopped abruptly, the girl immediately looked out of the window. She saw in front of her the dismounted knights, who for some reason lined up in one row and looked as if they were upset about something. The princess couldn't understand why everyone had stopped, but then she saw the crown prince standing in front of the knights and decided that something. The young passenger in the carriage was very excited. She did not understand what was happening and wondered if something bad had happened. The knights stood before their master and quietly talked among themselves about something. One of them said that this could not be. How could they not have foreseen such a thing? That was the question the crown prince now asked them. He said he could not believe that his knights were going to allow the princess to enter the capital in such a time-worn carriage. One of the knights immediately began to justify himself and asked the prince for permission to The prince did not let him finish his sentence and said that, however, the knight was ready to cry. He told His Highness that it was not something that would appear so easily simply because Colin also joined their conversation and informed His Highness that, despite the knight's explanation that the rule was that if a member of the imperial family, the young man who received the order did not know what to do but was forced to agree with everything, and said that he would. All this time, the little princess remained in the carriage, but looked out of the window and all the time looked in surprise and excitement at the people standing near her. The knight who had accompanied the girl throughout her journey saw the princess and decided that she was curious about what all the fuss was about. He looked at the girl and felt very sorry for her. The young princess simply nodded. He thought that everything looked exactly like that. This girl, more than anyone else, deserved to arrive at. Colin told the young man standing next to him that His Highness was right, and the princess deserved real honors on the occasion. The young man told his friend that he had an idea and asked how about having a parade. Even if they just had flowers and a band, the atmosphere would be completely different. The crown prince supported his. The knight bowed and told his master that he understood everything. He promised to send a man to the palace to report everything to the senior. After a while, the sound of horses' hooves was heard. A new carriage drove up to them. When the girl saw this real miracle of art, she could not hide her surprise and delight. She immediately said that this carriage was very beautiful. When she first looked at the carriage that had pulled up, she seemed to understand why His Highness the Prince. She came closer to the carriage and noticed that even its wheels were shining. The crown prince seemed to notice something strange in his sister's behavior. He asked her what was wrong and whether she liked the carriage. His little sister just sighed when she heard this. She asked the prince if there were really carriages made of flowers. She never thought that something like that could exist. The prince said that if she really wanted it, then such a carriage would be made for her, because she was his only sister. And the knights standing nearby heard the entire conversation between the prince and princess very well. They thought that this was not what His Highness ordered them to do. These young men immediately began to grumble and become indignant when the prince ordered them to immediately bring a carriage completely decorated. But the crown prince was not going to pay attention to these conversations. He said that this was His Highness's order, and they must prepare whatever the girl, who had remained silent all this time, suddenly realized that her silence seemed to have been misunderstood by her brother. The princess said that she liked this carriage very much, and to be honest, the last carriage was also good, even too good for her. So if all this, when the girl told the prince that she was happy with everything, he immediately replied that no one here. The princess looked closely at her brother's face. She noticed that the young man's eyes were red. He put his hand on the girl's shoulder and said that he would do everything to make her the happiest girl in the entire. The princess was touched by his words. Until now, she decided that she needed to try to be direct about her feelings right now. The girl smiled and thanked the prince for everything. And she repeated once again that she truly thought it was a wonderful carriage that suited her perfectly. Her brother realized that the girl was indeed telling the truth. He looked into her eyes and noticed that she now had the amber eyes of the Ascania family. He smiled because he was glad that those amber eyes showed that the girl was feeling happy now. The crown prince continued to smile. He was also happy, and so he told the girl that his little sister was a very kind child. Then he placed his hand on the girl's head and repeated in his mind once more, "My little sister." The young man felt happy because he finally had a sister, who also turned out to be so kind and modest. The little girl felt just as happy. She was a little surprised by her brother's words. But even when she sat down in the carriage and noticed that it was even more elegant inside, the girl continued to think that her heart was beating faster, not from fear or fear. The princess decided that her brother would travel with her in the same carriage. But since he was not there, she looked out of the carriage and asked the princess was taken aback by his words. She did not question the knight, but only wondered why there would be. In honor of the little princess's arrival, a real celebration was held in the capital. When they entered the city, thousands of colorful leaves were flying in the air. The city itself also impressed the little girl very much. It was rich, and all the houses looked well kept and decorated. The entire population of the capital and the surrounding villages gathered to see the arrival of the princess. People went out into the streets and greeted their little mistress with loud cries. When the princess saw all this, she thought that flowers were falling from the sky. But these were only petals, which the chamberlain and Colin had collected with such difficulty before. The girl stuck her hand out of the carriage to catch a couple of petals. She noticed that they were so soft. She was amazed by the beauty that had been created for her arrival. The blue sky. The princess noticed the surprised looks of the people. She heard the enthusiastic cries of the crowd, a strange and at the same time beautiful sight. She decided that her older brother, Chester Ascania, led the parade, and the girl was interested in everything she saw in the capital. When she looked out the window, she noticed a stone dragon and could not hide her delight at the fact that water was flowing straight from its mouth. With her mouth open, the princess watched the capital and its inhabitants. Everything was simply amazing and striking in its beauty. She noticed that there were buildings everywhere, connected to each other. And when she looked at another one, while she was still thinking that someone had deliberately left the building empty, their carriage drove up to the large gates and stopped near them. The princess was amazed by the words that the creature that was engraved on the castle doors was a dragon, a creature from ancient times. She immediately looked out of the carriage to see it with her own eyes. She was told that the dragon was depicted on the gate because the first emperor of Ascania had made a treaty with it in the distant past. The girl could not understand who this dragon from ancient times was. Everything here was new to her. This world was full of mysteries, but in her opinion, she should not rush with. The girl remembered how one of the slaves had once told her that one could become very smart if one read books. So when no one was looking, she would pick up a book and be happy when she found some interesting pictures. But she always wanted to know what it was like to be able to read. The door of her carriage opened slightly, and the figure of her elder brother appeared in it. He turned to her. The girl wanted to get out of the carriage, but her brother picked her up in his arms along with the toy and carried her towards the castle gates. As before, the girl was very interested. She turned her head so as not to miss anything and looked at both. When the brother and sister were almost at the door of the palace, people came out of it. They stopped in front of His Highness and bowed. The man standing in front greeted them and said, "Welcome back, Your Highness Chester." The man asked the prince if this was the child His Highness was talking about. He noticed that this man was already an old man. He bowed to them and thought about the conditions in which this little girl had to live. The crown prince immediately turned to the man and asked the chamberlain whether he had. The chamberlain said that yes, that was indeed the case, and handed him a letter sealed with wax. Chester told his sister that this letter was sent by His Majesty the Emperor. He is not in the palace now and could not greet her personally. That is why he sent the letter for her. The princess sighed heavily when she heard this. She had hoped to meet her father today, but it seemed. A moment later, the letter was handed to a little girl who didn't seem to know what to do with it and simply held it in her hands. She had never received a letter from anyone in her life, and now she simply held it in her hands, not knowing what to do with it next. The crown prince could not understand what had happened. He held the girl in his arms, but she still could not bring herself to open the letter she had received from the emperor. His little sister still didn't know what to do. She didn't dare say that she hadn't learned to read. After all, if she did, it seemed that the crown prince finally understood why she had not opened the letter. He said that the prince opened the envelope with the letter, took out the sheet of paper with the message, and began to read. The letter began with the words, "I have." The princess listened attentively to every word of her father's letter, in which he called her The emperor wrote to his daughter that he wanted to apologize for not. The emperor wrote that, despite the fact that he had not yet met his little daughter, he loved her with all his heart, and as soon as such an opportunity arose, he would immediately rush to her to meet her in person. He also wrote that he couldn't wait for the moment when they could be together. He promised that he would fly to her as soon as he finished all his urgent matters. He told the girl that a small gift had been prepared for her arrival, and after that, the prince took out a leaf. The princess was surprised when she heard from her brother that she was now Chloe of the princess couldn't believe what had happened. She had never had a name in her life, and now she was Princess. The girl was happy. She started to cry, but these were tears of joy. She knew what it meant for a person to have no name. Now she was grateful to her father and brother for this gift. It was the best gift she could have ever expected. The girl remembered that no matter how she pretended, she always envied the slaves who had a name. Even the plants by the road had some kind of name. She always remembered that the horses in the slave trader's stable and the other domestic animals had names, but she did not. Her older brother picked the princess up and stroked her head. He said that everything was right. The prince told the girl that his name was Chester Ascania. He said that she was Chloe, his sister, and he was one of her brothers. The princess smiled happily and said cheerfully, "I'm Chloe." The young man noticed the joy in his little sister's eyes. He felt happy that he had guessed what she wanted most. It was he who asked his father to. The prince was even more delighted when the girl called him Your Highness the Prince and asked him to take care of her. He was pleased by this request for care, but unfortunately for him, the girl could not yet call him by name and called him Highness. Suddenly, the young man felt sad because his sister didn't call him Big Brother. He thought that it seemed like he would have to try harder to get closer to her. The girl called him Highness again and looked questioningly at the young man's face. She thought that he looked strange, and perhaps she had. The little girl thought deeply again and suddenly fell silent. It was difficult for her to understand what she should do now. The prince cursed inwardly and thought that he had made a mistake somewhere. The prince said that no one knows what a newly emerged sprout can grow into. The princess began to examine the little sprout in her palms. It was so small and unprotected, as if it personified her. She continued to look at the sprout in her palms, and her brother said that a large, proud tree could grow from a small sprout. Or perhaps this sprout in her hands could later turn into a beautiful mountain flower. Chester added that this sprout has endless potential and endless hope. He still has his whole life ahead of him and he can become anything. The girl was very happy when her elder brother explained to her the meaning of the name she had received. The princess began to repeat her name in her mind. She had been grateful to her father before for receiving such a wonderful gift from him, and now she was simply happy after the meaning of her new name was explained to her. The prince lifted the girl high in his arms, looked into her face, and said that in his opinion, His Majesty had chosen a suitable name for her. The princess told the prince that she really wanted to thank His Majesty for everything, and asked when he would come to the capital. The young man realized that he couldn't tell the girl where her father was yet. His Majesty was leading an army to a bloody massacre right now, and a girl of her age didn't need to be told about it. After this, the senior chamberlain approached them again and told the prince and princess that the girl must be tired after the long journey. The prince replied that he understood everything. He said that it would be better to let the girl rest now. He then asked the chamberlain where the chambers intended for his sister were. His faithful servant explained that they had now prepared the princess's quarters in the prince's estate. The prince praised his servant for this decision and went inside his palace. The chamberlain hastened to add that this was not all. The news was sudden. They had all been forced to prepare in a hurry. Chloe was very surprised when she realized that something was wrong in this palace. She was dumbfounded by the fact that only men came out to greet the girl. She wondered if there were any women here. She looked around and decided that there were probably no women in the castle. Her brother noticed that the little girl began to fidget and squirm in his arms. He asked her what was wrong. Addressing her, he called her by her new name. But the girl did not answer at first. And then, when the girl asked the prince if all these people worked here, he answered her that there was no— The chamberlain told the girl that there was no need to observe formality. The prince said that there was no one who could be the highest princess in this palace, only her father, the emperor, and her brothers. The princess was very surprised when her brother said that it was quite possible that she was even— Chester said that in any case, her idea that all these people were working in the castle was absolutely correct, and asked the girl if there was something wrong with them. The girl replied that not at all, but again turned her head towards the assembled servants and added that she was surprised that there were only— She remembered that when she was on the estate as a slave, she saw mostly slaves in the kitchen, in the laundry room, and in the garden. It was the women who did the housework. They cooked, cleaned, washed, and— The princess thought that perhaps everything was different here. The crown prince's answer surprised her greatly. He said that all the men were here because women could not enter. When she asked her brother why women did not enter here, he replied that it was all because of the curse. The girl heard the word again. She didn't know its meaning, but she remembered that the prince had mentioned it on the day she was found. And at that moment when he was talking to the slave trader kneeling next to him, it was known to all that the curse was sent upon the people of Ascania for the sins committed by the first emperor. The princess remembered that on the way to the palace she had heard a conversation between the knights who accompanied her. They had also said something about a curse. She remembered their words about how, according to rumors, the curse would be— That is why, now sitting in the arms of her older brother, the girl asked him what kind of curse it was. The princess noticed that her brother seemed so exhausted. He seemed tired and had difficulty speaking. He started to speak. The princess thought again that perhaps she had asked something unnecessary. And so, in order not to offend— The prince told her that there was nothing secret there, and it was not something she could not ask about. After some time, he promised to tell her everything. The prince and his little sister continued to walk towards his chambers. He said that the curse was not something that all people should know about. Chester told her that perhaps they should start from the beginning. And without knowing what happened in the beginning, no one would be able to understand why the curse on their family arose. The young man carried a little girl in his arms. They had almost reached the chambers intended for her. Everywhere they were humbly met by loyal servants. The girl kept spinning in her arms. She simply had to see everything with her own. Chloe admired everything about this beautiful house, its decoration, the luxury of the walls and doors, the beautiful furniture, and the luxurious carpets and tapestries. Her brother said that all this was meant only for her, and she would use it to the fullest. He also said that a real princess deserves the best. The senior chamberlain, who was walking behind them, asked the prince for forgiveness. After the prince said that the furniture was not suitable for a child, the old man did not expect the princess to be smaller than her peers. He informed the crown prince thought that even if there had been no girls living in the palace before, was it really impossible to find a single room that was at least somewhat suitable for? But it seemed that his sister was completely satisfied with everything. She only oohed and awed, enthusiastic. She liked everything about it and couldn't understand why her brother looked so upset, or maybe even angry. The prince sat his little sister down on the sofa, stroked her cheek and told her that it was only for a while. Chester stroked her cheek and adjusted her hair a little so he could see his little sister's eye. The prince sat down right opposite her and asked the girl to look at him. When the girl had fulfilled his request, the young man said that here, in this house, she could feel like a real mistress. The prince said that her eyes were a sign of their lineage, and on the contrary, everyone envied these eyes. And now he must tell her what she should do. The princess couldn't understand what her brother might want from her. She tried to guess what she had to do. Of course, if she had been placed in such a beautiful place, there would probably be work that she had to do. But as it turned out, the prince's request was not at all difficult for her. He said that first she needed to eat. Then the young man said that whenever the princess wanted to play, she could play without embarrassment. When she slept, Chloe was literally shocked by her older brother's words. She still couldn't understand why she had to eat a lot, play well, and sleep soundly. Was that all she had to do? Chester leaned over to his sister, smiled at her, and asked her to eat well so that her new clothes would fit. He stroked the girl's head and said that this was her first homework assignment. This day was very hard and long for the little princess. She was amazed by, unlike her previous home in the slave trader's house, this room was completely silent. When the girl went to bed, she didn't forget about her little friend either. A soft plush puppy settled down next to her on a soft white pillow. But the girl's sleep did not last long. She suddenly woke up and began to think about what had happened to her. It seemed to her that the girl jumped out of her bed in horror and sat up, thinking that she shouldn't sleep for so long and that she needed to get ready and go to work now. When she began to look around, she noticed that she was in some wonderful place, which was significantly different from what she had seen all her life. To calm herself down a little, Chloe picked up her little friend and hugged him tightly. She closed her eyes and began to think about what had happened to her. She still could not get used to the new. The princess sat on the edge of her bed and began to think about what to do next. In her previous life, she was accustomed to short sleep in rather Spartan conditions, and now on this soft mattress and snow white. When she stepped with her bare foot on the floor, she thought that everything in this house was simply lovely, and the bed and the floor were very. She thought again of her former home, where they had to shelter themselves with straw and life in that place was really cruel. Everyone was trying to survive, and so no one cared about each other. It was unlikely that she would be able to make friends with anyone. But she still managed to do it. Her friend was an exception. They became truly close people. The princess decided to walk around her room again and began to look at its beautiful stucco ceilings. But she could not stop thinking about the boy, and now she was most interested in the question of whether this boy was okay. Whether something. The princess hugged her toy even tighter, stroked its head, and began to hope that she would soon see another friend of hers. She thought about how much had happened in her life since she said goodbye to him. She knew that when Sunday came, Chloe walked over to the nightstand where the box was. She opened the box and looked again. The girl looked at it carefully and remembered that the sprout in the ancient language sounds like Chloe. She began to smile again. The most important and precious thing that the girl hugged her toy and thought how wonderful it was to have her own name and to call someone by. She remembered her friend and decided that Sunday needed a name too. He too was no longer a slave and deserved to receive one. Chloe looked into her toy's eyes and told her, "Just who will name this boy? Maybe we should ask Prince Chester to name him." She was very curious about what name this former little slave would get. She would really like to address him by his name as soon as possible. But so that her puppy would not be offended, the girl promised him that, of course, she would never forget about him and would play with him just as before. The princess didn't even notice that the night was over while she was talking to her toy. She looked out the window and was surprised to see that it was morning and she could do something else. At the same time, there was a knock at her door. It was very quiet, but then the girl turned towards the door and said that she had woken up and had been up for a long time. The door immediately opened, and the head of the senior chamberlain appeared, who greeted the princess, asked her forgiveness. The chamberlain led her through the long corridors of the palace, and eventually, when the princess was seated on a chair, she thought that there was even too much food. Little did the princess know that the palace's eldest had been hovering over the head chef until the morning. He told him that he had to prepare his best dishes so that the princess would not be disappointed. Her brother, the crown prince, also did not stay away from this. He brought exquisite delicacies and told her to cook something from them so that the princess would gain weight faster. The result of all these actions was what the girl saw before her now. She was especially struck by the yogurts in beautiful tall glasses. There were also beets, pickled vegetables, and cold soup. The girl was very surprised by these exquisite dishes. She admired the boiled turnips and fried salmon with spices. The princess thought there was so much food. Maybe she just imagined it. But each time there was more and more food. Since the tables were simply groaning with food, the girl was delighted. The reason for this was the thought that perhaps this meant that someone else would be having breakfast with her. The senior chamberlain approached her and said that after her meal he was going to tell her in more detail about today's schedule and asked if that would suit her. The girl listened attentively to the man, who said that after breakfast she would have free time and then she could walk in the garden. The girl thought that toys were good. In fact, she had never had a single toy before. When the girl thanked the servant, he said that it was very nice, wished her a bon appetit, and Philip bowed to his little mistress and reminded her again that if she needed or wanted anything, she should let him know at once. This was new to her. She was discouraged by the fact that she could easily give orders to people older than her. Previously, the princess decided that she should not take advantage of this. The chamberlain smiled at her and asked her not to be shy about addressing him. He said that perhaps because of her shyness, the girl smiled happily. She now understood that if she asked about something she didn't know, no one would scold her. When the servant bowed to her, she told him that it was good. She understood everything. And now she would definitely ask him if there was anything she didn't understand or was interested in. At this moment, the door of the dining room opened and a young servant entered. He turned to the chamberlain and told him that the crown prince was looking for him. He asked the girl if she had any questions, and if everything was clear to her, then he would have to go to her brother. Philip suggested that she cover her legs with a napkin, wished her a pleasant appetite, and promised. The man approached the door of the crown prince's office, knocked on it, and asked the young man if he had summoned him. When he received permission to enter the room, he noticed that the prince was sitting at his desk. The young man did not turn around, but only said that they had something to talk about. Then the young man turned his head to the servant who had entered and said that he had a very important question. He asked how his sister was doing and if everything was all right with her. The senior chamberlain immediately replied that the girl was definitely in the dining room. Chester asked his servant how his previous order was going. He wondered if they had started to carry it out. Philip replied to his young master that the barber should arrive the following day, and the tailor would begin taking measures. When the prince said that he understood that, because the girl needed good shoes, and asked if Chester wanted to finish all these things as quickly as possible. That is why he told his servant that there should be no delay in preparing everything necessary for the little princess. The prince seemed visibly agitated and nervous. He began to tap his knuckles on the table and asked the chamberlain what. The senior chamberlain replied that an official job posting had already been issued. Everyone knew that they needed a nanny for the palace and that many people from different cities were expected to arrive. This seemed to disturb the prince a little. He thought for a moment, and it was evident from his face that he wanted to tell the chamberlain something very important. At this time, the prince was thinking about the fact that women cannot enter the castle to avoid the effects of the curse. But as a result, the young man had no doubt that many of them would decide to pretend to be ordinary maids just to get inside the imperial palace. Many of these women had only one goal. If they were lucky enough to conceive a child from the king, the crown prince thought that they would definitely encounter such intentions. But now there was an urgent need to hire maids because someone had to look after his little sister and fulfill her wishes. The prince nervously pounded his fist on the floor and decided that it was still necessary to carefully select candidates for the vacancy of maids. After all, he told the chamberlain that they couldn't keep the princess's existence a secret forever. Chester thought that it was hard to even imagine how the princess's appearance could affect the situation in the capital. That is why it is necessary to take everything into account and prepare for any A knight standing next to him asked the prince if he planned to release the guard dogs to drive away uninvited guests from. The crown prince considered whether he should do this. If he let the guard dogs loose now, it might be said that there was something wrong in the imperial palace. The young prince began to think about how he could protect the little princess. Before him stood the chamberlain, and Chester remembered that this young man always accompanied his sister on the road, and the little princess liked him so much. Perhaps he would be a good candidate for. The prince knew very well that the knight his sister liked so much was a paladin. This title is not given to everyone you meet, but only to the most talented knights. Another advantage in choosing this particular man was that he had 6 brothers and sisters. As the crown prince knew, the young man really liked children. The prince looked at the knight again and thought that no one would be better suited to be the princess's guard. He called out to the knight and said that he had something to tell him. He said that he was being appointed the princess's guard, and Colin bowed deeply upon hearing this and said that he would be happy to carry out this order. There was another knight standing behind the emperor at the time. He thought that even if his comrade was talented, the prince should think twice about who would be. Without even turning his head back, the prince answered him that everything was fine. And very soon, when another prince named Zed arrived, he would appoint another man as a guard for the princess. Hearing this, Colin's face immediately changed. It was as if lightning had flashed over. The second prince was called Zed. He was, like his master, also a prince and stood next in line to his father's. The young man thought it was very strange how the two princes were so different from each other. But at the same time, they communicated. It was thanks to the appearance of this little girl in their lives that the curse of the imperial family disappeared. As the prophecy said, the young prince took from his desk a sheet of paper on which he had previously made. The senior royal servant reread the list compiled by his young master and replied that he thought that if he hurried, he could start in a week. After his answer, the young gentleman's face changed. It showed signs of obvious displeasure. The chamberlain had no choice but to agree with the will of his young master. He said that they would make every effort and prepare everything in 2 or 3 days. He said goodbye to the prince and went back to the dining room. On the way, he looked at the sheet of paper and thought that Chester was still sitting in his office at his desk. He was thinking about everything he still needed to do. At one point, he said to a knight standing nearby that he was saying that they still couldn't contact. The young man did not understand what his master was talking about, and he said only one word. At that moment, the prince turned his head sharply towards him and seemed to demand an immediate answer to his question. And the young man began to report to his master that the tower of His Highness Ezra was constantly. The conversation was about the third of the emperor's sons. The prince said that it was necessary to find the prince as quickly as possible and inform him of the existence of the princess. He could not understand why he lived in such a place. Chester reminded the knight once again that it was necessary to find his brother, and therefore he should continue to gather information. The knight replied that he understood and asked His Highness for permission to take his leave. Colin saw that his master seemed to have finished all his business and he could ask him the question that interested him. He asked the prince when he planned to inform the princess about everything. The prince turned to him and asked what exactly he meant. Colin replied that he believed the little princess had a right to know that the curse of the family meant being killed by the one she loved. The young prince thought about what he should do. Of course, he had mentioned the curse of their family to the little girl a couple of times before. It was a very difficult topic for him. Firstly, there was no right moment. And he was Besides, there was another good reason why he didn't want this business. At the moment, he didn't want to frighten the princess in any way, and therefore he thought that the time had not yet. The young man thought that it would definitely be difficult for the girl to comprehend everything The young man decided that it would be acceptable to tell her everything when she came to her senses. She looked so vulnerable and alone at that moment. She hugged her toy tightly, and he watched her for a long time after he covered the girl with his cloak. He couldn't help but remember how the girl had looked during their trip. He remembered stroking the defenseless creature. That is why Chester ordered his knight, whom he had appointed as the princess's guard today, to make sure that the girl never heard. Colin answered him that he would do everything as the prince wished. But at that time, he thought that it would still be better to tell the princess everything right now. The young knight had already turned to leave his master's office. He said goodbye to him and said, at that moment, there was a very loud and impatient knock on the door of His Highness's office. Colin glanced worriedly towards the door and grabbed the hilt of his sword. The crown prince's face looked just as worried, unable to understand what had caused such an impatient invasion. When the prince gave permission to enter, one of the servants literally burst into his office. The young servant apologized to his master for disturbing him, but said that he could not. The prince was very worried by the servant's words. He realized that his little sister was in the dining room now. The young man immediately jumped up and his chair fell to the floor with a crash. The crown prince shouted loudly to the servant who had arrived, asking what had happened to Chloe. The imperial family of Ascania has a very cruel tradition. Few people know about it, but besides, everything remains in deep secrecy, so that the subjects do not find out about it. This tradition holds that to prove his right to the throne, the first prince must stab the current emperor, and this must be done without the slightest hesitation. Crown Prince of Chester Ascania was not yet ready to do this, but now the knights noticed a striking change in their master. The prince jumped up from his seat, worried about his little sister, who, in his opinion, could be. When they looked closely at his eyes, they realized that they were not mistaken, because they changed their color to green. The servant who came immediately hurried to calm the prince. He said that the princess was not eating anything and refused to take food. Chester immediately asked him how much time had passed since she went on hunger strike. The boy told him that it probably lasted about a few minutes. But the girl thought it was incredible. She was determined to hold out and not touch any food. It was the complete opposite of when she had to starve for days in the slave owner's house. The princess thought that it was not cold at all, and the chair was very soft and comfortable. If she thought the girl sat on a chair in front of the breakfast table and did not touch her food. She decided that this way, she sighed heavily and again pushed away the desire to taste something delicious. She didn't want anyone to hear that sigh. She continued to wait, sitting calmly on the chair, but suddenly she shuddered after the front door to the dining room quick. The crown prince burst into the room and loudly shouted the little girl's name. The princess remained absolutely calm. She stood up, turned towards the young man who had entered and greeted him. She laughed, realizing that her idea of fasting had worked. As she had expected, the prince showed up as soon as he found out that she was not eating. The young man was simply stunned by the smile on the girl's lips. He thought the crown prince smiled back at his sister. He was pleased that she smiled, but then the young man decided that such behavior on his part would be wrong. He needed to address the girl firmly and force her to eat. The prince knelt down in front of his seated sister and said that he had been informed that she was not eating. The little princess immediately said that everything was not like that at all. And when the prince asked if she liked the food, she said that everything was very tasty. but today she had not tried anything yet. The girl looked at the dishes lying on the table and said to her brother with disappointment that everything looked very tasty. Her older brother followed her and looked at the table. In his opinion, everything looked pretty good too, and knowing their court chef, he decided that he had done a good job, and probably all the dishes had turned out great. The prince did not understand why the girl did not eat anything in that case. That is exactly what he began to ask her about. Chloe was silent at first. She didn't know if she would be punished for refusing, but in the end, the girl thought that she had nothing to lose, and if she had already decided to act in this way, then she should explain everything. The young man immediately realized what had happened. The girl probably didn't want to eat alone, and so she decided to call him here. When he realized this, he immediately asked her for— Chester told his sister that he sincerely apologized for being late. He explained that he had to stay late to sort out some issues that had arisen. The prince began to think and came to the conclusion that, apparently, he thought he would do the same thing during lunch and dinner if he had the chance. So he told the girl, who was surprised by his words. The prince stood up and told the girl that he apologized for not warning her earlier. Hearing his words, the princess immediately smiled, and the prince thought that this smile was worth a lot. The prince sat down on his chair, and when the servant asked him if anyone else would come to breakfast, hearing his words, Chloe sighed heavily. She thought that she was so looking forward to meeting her other older brothers, but she hadn't been able to meet them yet. She suddenly thought that perhaps her elder brothers did not want to see her at all. She did not know what kind of people they were, and therefore she thought that they would not be as kind to her as the crown. Her older brother was surprised by the girl's question, who asked him why she had not yet met the other two brothers. The prince decided to explain to her why this had not happened yet. He told her that the second prince, Zed, was currently away on business at the border. And the third prince, Chloe was very happy when he reassured her, said that they had already been notified, and in his opinion, they were also— The prince told the girl that the other two princes were also eager to see her. The princess listened attentively to her brother, who said that the third prince would immediately rush to the palace as soon as he received news. Chester told her that she would definitely meet everyone soon, but for now he wanted to ask her to be a little patient. The girl immediately agreed and promised that she would be patient and look forward to the meeting. One of the servants standing in the dining room literally froze and was dumbfounded by what he had just seen. He couldn't believe his eyes because just now, His Highness, the Crown Prince, personally put food on someone else's plate. All the servants in the castle considered the prince to be a cold-blooded embodiment of heartlessness, who did not show a single human emotion. The other servants were simply dumbfounded by this. They watched, and the prince asked the girl if she wanted anything else. He thought that perhaps she was still not used to talking about when she wanted something. The prince thought that perhaps no one had ever offered the girl anything as a gift. Never in her life had she been able— The prince decided that this might be his sister's first request in her short life. He said that she should simply speak up about whatever she needed. He looked at the girl sitting in front of him and became extremely curious about what his sister would ask for. The girl smiled sweetly at her brother, and he thought that perhaps it would be a new doll or some fancy dress. He kept his eyes on his sister and decided what she would want. Maybe shoes or jewelry or some toys. His little sister asked for something he never expected from her. She asked the prince if he could give— The prince repeated the word Sunday loudly and wondered if this was really the scruffy little boy he had met in the slave owner's house. Chester wondered if his sister's first request was to give this rascal a name. Chloe looked at her brother with sadness in her eyes. It was as if she was silently begging him to grant— Her older brother told the girl that he would definitely think about it. The little princess immediately burst into loud laughter and began to thank His Highness. The prince immediately said that perhaps she shouldn't have asked for that. He said that he meant that she wanted something else. He also asked her to tell him when she wanted something. The young man told his sister that she could ask for anything. He thought that a child who grew up in an environment where— Chester thought about how great it would be if only his sister could smile brightly. If only he could make up. The prince was brought out of his thoughts by the same little girl. She took the soft toy in her hands. The prince understood that she wanted a name. He said that he would gladly do so. The princess thought that if only she could learn to think a little more about herself, she might find some cherished wish. She really did have one. Chloe did say that she really wanted to read the book. There are so many things in this world that she doesn't understand yet, and she wants to learn everything about the things she doesn't know, and also learn the alphabet. The prince promised that her wish would be granted. He said that official lessons were postponed for a while. However, when the crown prince told his sister that in return she should prioritize her health and not study to his detriment, the princess immediately agreed and thanked him. The prince thought for a moment about what else he should do. He said that he thought it would be better to build a separate library for the girl. The princess thought that she didn't want that at all, and so she said that she didn't think she needed. But Chester told her again that she could not think of the library as a private study and reading room. He and the other princes also had such a room, where they kept the books they. The girl was surprised by her elder brother's words. Could it be that her wish had come true, and now the crown prince told her that he would arrange for the premises to be prepared as soon as possible? The princess could not believe everything that was happening to her. The princess immediately became happy and smiled joyfully. She could not believe that all this was really happening to her. It seemed to her like it was a wonderful. Chester looked at her closely and thought that this was the first time his little sister had said what she really wanted. He thought that his sister would definitely not study in a regular library. He also did not intend to send her to study with some unremarkable and poor in knowledge teacher. The prince decided that the girl needed to get acquainted with economics, politics, culture, and for this he should personally contact the academy. When everything was decided between them and the princess was satisfied with her brother's promises, she took a spoon in her hand and began to eat her breakfast with pleasure. After breakfast, her elder brother referred to some urgent matters and asked the girl's forgiveness for not being able to spend the morning with her. So she went to. Chloe exclaimed happily when she saw her new friend in her room. She called loudly for the boy named Colin. The young man first wished her good morning and then straightened up and said that it was no longer morning but lunchtime. And he asked the girl what she would like for lunch. The princess began to jump up and down and spin around. The young man was very surprised when she told him that she had breakfast with her brother. He also learned about the girl that the prince had brought her lunch and even dessert. When the girl addressed the knight by name, and he asked if anything was bothering her, she told him that she remembered her name. Colin laughed and said that was just great. He said that if she didn't mind, could he please find out? The boy thought it looked very cute. The girl suddenly became happy and began to shout loudly that The knight immediately knelt down in front of the girl and bowed his head before her. He placed his hand on his chest near his heart and said that he, Colin, paladin of the 3rd Squad, swears allegiance to Princess Chloe and gives his word to. The girl listened attentively to the knight, who said that from that moment on, no matter what danger she was in, Colin told her that he would always protect her. The girl thought that before it was difficult for her to understand what exactly this young man told her, but now she began to understand everything. As the knight called to protect the princess stood and read his oath to the little girl, she thought that no matter. The princess laughed and thanked the young man for his promise and asked what they could do now. The girl thought that she had wanted to say for a long time about how her life had changed. Tasty food, a warm bed. The boy was still sitting in front of her and thanked her for allowing him to defend her. The girl decided that there was probably no friendlier and more beautiful place on earth. Chloe thought that she needed to fit in here. She needed to be a good kid too, and so she would work hard to make sure that no one would ever hate her or throw her out. The young man decided to ask the princess if she had been bored with His Highness today while they were having lunch. The little princess smiled and replied that not at all. It had been a great time with her brother, and His Highness had been very kind. The knight imagined his master behaving nicely. He had a hard time doing this because in his memory he looked Chloe told about today's breakfast. She told the prince that she wanted to read books, so he gave her a large room to study. He also said that he would teach her to write tomorrow. The princess was very happy with the knight's statement, who noticed that she was very smart, so that very soon she would be able to show herself in all her glory. Colin seemed to be very worried when someone knocked on the door of the room. He quickly turned his head towards the door and grabbed the hilt of his sword. After the guard gave permission, two servants entered the room, bringing a huge mirror and a small chair. The princess was very surprised when her friend told her that it seemed the barber had already arrived, and so the servants were preparing a work. The girl became very worried when she thought about her hair being cut off. What worried her most was the thought that they wanted to cut off her bangs. She remembered what her brother had said about her eyes. He had said that many people were jealous of her for having such unusual eyes. The little princess was seated in a chair prepared for her haircut. She couldn't say that she didn't want it. The princess decided that she would not give. Her friend seemed to realize that she was feeling out of place. He came up to her, smiled, and said that if she didn't want to get her hair cut now, that was okay, and they could do it some other time. The girl listened attentively to the knight, who also said that no one could force the princess to do something she did not want. The little princess sat quietly in her chair and thought deeply. She didn't want to hurt anyone. But if the barber had come and was supposed to cut her hair, then maybe she should agree to it. Finally, she decided that she would do it, and said that she still needed. When Colin approached her, the girl asked him to look into her eyes and tell her if they looked strange or ugly. The young man smiled back at her and said that it was not so at all. In his opinion, she had beautiful and very. The girl asked him again if they were really cute and if he was lying to her so that she wouldn't get upset. Colin said that she really has beautiful eyes. They shine brighter than He laughed again and said that anyone would agree with him. And it didn't matter who it. Chloe thought again about how strangely everything in her life had turned upside down. What seemed normal yesterday, the girl's former owner, an evil and cruel slave owner, always told her that her eyes were the mark of a loser. The evil girl who gave her orders in the same house and always looked for a reason to make fun of her said that she had But His Highness the Prince, as well as the knight who became her best friend in the palace, the senior chamberlain and other servants never looked at her askance and treated her well. The princess thought for a moment again. The thought occurred to her that perhaps everyone. And at that moment, the little princess made her final decision. She said loudly that she wanted to cut her bangs. She sat in a comfortable chair and looked into the mirror opposite her. When the knight asked her if everything would be okay, she answered that of course it would be. Chloe decided that she really needed to change her look a little. She wanted to look different. A woman was walking down the corridor of the huge imperial palace. She had been summoned to satisfy. She followed the senior chamberlain who showed her the way. She thought that the capital of the empire she was a barber, and she liked everything about this city. The whole culture, from music, painting. The woman was thinking about how her first client was a princess. But the hairdresser thought that these words were a little different from what she had heard about the princess before. The servant said that this girl was soft and gentle. She remembered how one of the noble women who came to her salon told her that apparently the princess was a very nasty lady. Sar A approached the door, on which the old servant immediately knocked. She said that she understood. The woman was very nervous because she was meeting the first princess of the imperial family, but she still pulled herself together and she told the girl her name and said that today she had the honor of being her barber. The next moment she looked at the little princess and thought that she didn't look at all like she thought a princess should look. Sar made a small curtsy and told the girl that she was looking forward to them getting started with the haircut. She looked again at this little girl and decided that she did not look like any of the princes at all, and there did not seem to be an ounce of Ascania blood in her. The princess smiled broadly back at her, said she was very pleased to meet her guest, and said her name was Chloe. The barber was simply stunned by how simply this girl behaved. She was exactly the same child as she had met hundreds of on the streets of the city, and perhaps the same children were all over their country. The woman looked aggressively at the old man standing in the room and thought that he had only frightened her for nothing. The senior chamberlain only smiled slyly when he saw the barber's angry gaze directed at him. The woman took a large blanket to cover her little client's clothes and asked her if the girl had any specific preferences. When the princess replied that there was absolutely none and said that she just needed to cut her bangs, Sarah asked her if perhaps she wanted something else. The woman was simply stunned by the girl's words. She was literally dumbfounded after she told her that she didn't know, and she had never had a hairdresser before. The barber took the girl's hair in her hand and thought that this was the first time in her life that she had encountered hair that had not been cared for at all. And if you look closely, and while the girl was looking in the mirror at what her hairdresser was doing behind her, she told her that Colin, who was standing next to them, seemed to be worried too, because he asked if it would be too short. Sar A answered him that hair damaged to such an extent will not be restored. The barber began her work. She took the scissors and began to cut the girl's hair, but then she stopped and the woman looked at the little princess's hand, which was peeking out from under the sleeve of her dress. She couldn't believe it. The barber began to remember how she once had a foreign noble family in her salon, and they just happened to have a slave with a... She looked again at the girl sitting in front of her and thought that perhaps this child was not a... The woman was still wondering if it was a slave mark on the back of the girl's hand. But then she pulled herself together and the girl looked as if she was unhappy. But the woman promised her that everything would be fine and that when the barber immediately reassured herself. She knew that if she had been brought to a princess, then this child really was a princess. How could she? The woman bowed to the girl sitting in the chair in front of her and said that she would now begin her work. Chloe decided not to look at it because she was so scared of the sound of the scissors screeching. The barber worked very quickly and nimbly. The hair she cut quickly fell to the floor, and when the girl heard the scissors stop working, she carefully opened her eyes to see the result of the same woman's work. Behind her stood Sar A, who clasped her hands so much, saying that the princess was very beautiful. Chloe replied that she liked it, and the barber told the girl that now it was necessary to choose a ribbon. She also said that satin would look... The girl turned her head towards where the box stood, which the woman had just opened. Inside this box were multicolored ribbons. They were bright, like the colors of a real rainbow. And the princess immediately liked them. She decided to choose the color green for herself, because it was the same color as the sprout that His Majesty had given her. The woman immediately began to praise how the ribbon suited the princess. She said that the color... It seemed that this barber herself liked what she was able to do to the little princess. Philip said that the princess really suits her new hairstyle and she looks simply amazing. Colin said it was simply amazing. But the woman was not satisfied with their words. She thought, what kind of men are these? They should say something more if they want to compliment her. And the barber's little client said only one word. She asked if what they were saying was true. The young man who accompanied her said that this was indeed true, and he was happy that from now on he could see her sweet face every day. The senior chamberlain confirmed that he had not lied at all, and the little lady looked very beautiful. The hairdresser made another curtsy and said that her work was finished. The woman told the princess that if the opportunity arose, she should visit her again. Chloe laughed merrily and said that she would definitely do it. She promised, clapped her hands when she heard her words. She thought it was so sweet. When they left the room and the chamberlain told her that they would pay her right away and asked her to follow him, the woman stopped and asked for forgiveness. The old servant was surprised by her request. She said it was about the princess, and she thought it would be a good idea to pick out some gloves for her. Seeing the surprise on his face, the barber explained that the seal on the girl's hand was not something that should be on the hand of a person from the... Philip thought that the princess often fiddled with her hands. Perhaps she was trying to hide her seal. He wondered why they hadn't noticed it before. But he reminded the woman that in a place like this, sometimes the hairdresser realized that she may have made a mistake. She apologized and said that Then the woman said that, whatever the case, she really wanted to help the princess. The senior chamberlain thought he was a little mistaken. At first, he was worried, because there were rumors that this woman was extremely greedy for money. The barber was very pleased with the words of the chamberlain, who told her that from the following week she should come to the... The woman still couldn't believe her luck. The best master of the capital, Sarah Mace, will now be Princess Chloe's personal hairdresser. Meanwhile, time in the palace flew by for the little princess at an unprecedented speed. She did not notice, with all her worries, how quickly several weeks she had enough to do. Tailors were invited to her. She looked through a lot of beautiful and unusual clothes. When she was being fitted, the tailor was blindfolded so he wouldn't see the brand on her hand. In this way, they listened to the words of her personal barber. Now Chloe felt like a real princess. They did her hair beautifully, picked out great outfits, and made sure she looked great. The girl had many lessons and all kinds of goodies and toys that a princess could wish for. But still, the girl's greatest pleasures came from those moments. Usually, the prince began a meeting with the young princess with the same question. He asked her what she had been doing that day. Chloe always enjoyed the opportunity to share with her brother. She would tell him with a smile on her lips in the smallest details about everything that happened to her. And so the girl did not notice at all how a whole month had flown by since her appearance in the imperial palace. When the girl thought that a whole month had already passed, she began to think with pleasure that the moment would soon come when Sunday. She lay in her room and looked at its furnishings in the moonlight. Today, she could not sleep because she kept thinking about her little friend. She remembered what the boy looked like when they lived in the slave owner's house. Unlike that damned house, here no one would. The princess lay on her pillow, looking at the ceiling, and still could not fall asleep. She thought that she had a great gift for the boy. She hoped that he would like it very much. In the morning, the senior chamberlain told the princess that, starting tomorrow, the maids would help her dress. Since the staff of maids for the little princess had not yet been selected, the man himself had to do this. Philippe also told the princess that all the maids had gone through a rigorous selection process, and the next morning the girl heard a loud knock at her door. From behind it, she literally jumped up when she heard the chamberlain say that the princess had been waiting for them for a long time, and that they could be taken. The girl felt her heart beating faster and faster in her chest. She had been waiting for this meeting for so long and was now. A moment later, the boy entered her room, but he was not as she remembered him from their last meeting. The princess's eyes flashed in her friend's direction and she joyfully shouted his name. The boy did not say a single word in response. With a sad face, he bowed. Chloe couldn't understand what was going on. Was her friend sick or maybe under the influence? Sunday did not answer her question. Only words of greeting came from his lips. The girl still couldn't understand what was happening. She was very curious about what had happened to her friend. She thought he would be happy to see her, but now it seemed as the princess thought that before her, as if, was not Sunday, but a stranger. It was the knight who had remained in the slave owner's house when they left. He shouted to the boy that he had told him not to run here. Chloe curtsied to the knight, a gesture she had recently learned, and said, "Hello, His. Thank you for delivering Sunday safely." The knight also greeted the princess. He said that she looked better already. The new style. He would probably have said something else, but he was stopped by a strong blow to the back from another knight, who said that he should watch his language in the presence of the princess. His said that in any case it was an honor to meet the princess again. He gave his name and said that he was a paladin of the 3rd Night Squad. The girl replied that she was pleased to meet him. She said her name was Chloe Ascani. When the knight told the princess that she seemed to have become brighter during the time they had not seen each other, and added that it was great that she now had a name, she looked towards the boy, who still looked sad, and told him that she was so glad to see him again, and then asked if he was hurt or if he. When the boy replied that he was fine, she told him that she had prepared something for him. Sunday stood next to her and did not move. Taking his hand, the girl thought that she wanted. And then the princess smiled at her old friend from ear to ear and said just one word to him. Theo. The boy looked at her in surprise, and she hastened to explain to him that this was now his name. The princess began to explain to him that the word Theo, in translation from the ancient language, means gift of God. The girl smiled again and said that her name was Chloe. She watched the boy standing and noticed that there was such a dark aura around him. She became curious. Perhaps the boy did not like this name. When the girl asked him if he wanted a different name or if he didn't like it and they could choose another one, finally the boy spoke. Standing before the princess, he said that he was very grateful to her. The princess heard someone approach her from behind and immediately turned her head sharply. Her guard came up to her. It was Colin, who said that he apologized to the princess and added that he did not know. That evening, the princess lay in her bed for a long time and could not fall asleep. The princess wondered if something bad had happened to the boy. She kept frowning, unable to find an answer to the question that interested her. She remembered how cheerful the boy's face used to be. Every time he saw her, he would smile and shout her name loudly. The girl was also always happy to see her friend and enjoyed every opportunity to see him. The princess remembered her last meeting with her friend. She really wanted to touch him, so she raised her hand up. She didn't understand why he was silent. She would have liked very much for him to talk to her, but she was never able to get the former little slave to talk. No matter how hard she tried, he remained silent, and this upset her greatly. It began to seem to her that this boy had become a complete stranger to her in a month. The princess blamed herself for and then she said loudly to the boy just one word. "Why?" And when he didn't answer, she called him by his new name, Theo, and said it was she. But the princess's little friend didn't answer. He turned around and walked towards the door. No matter how much she watched the boy walk further and further down the hallway. In her mind, she screamed at him not to leave her alone. Now, sitting in her bed, trying in vain to fall asleep, her thoughts kept returning to today's conversation. The princess was close to hysterics. She was ready to cry. She was still sitting in her bed, sighing heavily. She really wanted to believe that all of this was just a nightmare. Chloe thought she would never be able to sleep again. The word Theo kept running through her head, and she nervously clutched her favorite toy to her chest. The girl came to the conclusion that perhaps he even hated her now. And all this could be because she was a princess. But then, why did he speak to her so respectfully and not smile at all? Chloe realized that she wouldn't be able to sleep until she found out the truth. She got out of her bed, walked over and opened the creaking door, and decided that she needed to see Theo right now. When the princess came out into the corridor, there was dead silence. There was no one behind her door, and she called out to her guard. She swallowed nervously and thought that for some reason there was no one here now. It was surprising, and it scared and worried her a little. But the princess did not want to go back to her room. She wanted to see her friend, and so she walked with a firm step down the corridor, trying to find him. Eventually, she came to a place where the corridor was least illuminated. It was completely dark inside, so the princess stopped, trying to see what was ahead. She was scared, and so she shuddered nervously. The girl could not see the end of the corridor, and Chloe began to listen to the sounds in the hallway. It seemed to her that she was not alone here. Some strange sounds were heard, and so she asked who was there. The princess saw a man whose features were barely distinguishable because of the darkness. He was standing near the... She also noticed that the man turned his head in her direction and smiled slightly. The princess was very surprised when this man suddenly leaned towards her face and asked the girl what she was doing there at such a late hour. Chloe began to look closely at the young man and noticed that he had platinum hair. She also began to know... The girl wondered if this was her older brother and said, "Your Highness, Chester." But the man standing opposite her didn't answer, but only chuckled quietly and smiled. After this, the young man laughed loudly and told the girl that she was so funny. When he had laughed enough, the princess thought that this man had called his Highness Chester, elder brother. And so, perhaps as she thought, her other brother, a girl, asked him that he, his Highness... It seems that she made the right decision since the young man did not object to her and said that she was quite smart. The young man knelt down in front of his little sister to see her face better. When he saw her, his expression seemed to change a little too. He looked at the little girl standing in front of him in surprise and said, it was very dark in the corridor, and the prince could not examine the little princess's features in detail. The young man continued to look at the little child and could not believe that she was really there. When the princess asked him if he was lying, Zed said how such an angel could be. Chloe told him she wasn't sure. Then the prince said it wasn't good and began to stretch the girl's face. The prince said that she was so sweet, but in the end, the girl felt pain. She broke away from his arms and abruptly turned away from the young man. The prince was only amused by all this. He burst out laughing and said that he. Then the young man calmed down and began to think out loud about his sister. He told her that her cheeks were not plump and soft enough to be squeezed. Chloe looked impatiently at the face of this impudent man. Her face expressed extreme displeasure, but she did not know what. But it seems that all this was just a joke. The prince soon calmed down and told her that he was really glad. He leaned towards the girl again and suggested that they now greet each other properly. The young man said that he was the second prince of. The prince placed his hand on the girl's head and said that he welcomed our young savior. She thanked the young man after he said that she had already managed to learn manners here, and this was very commendable. Chloe looked at the young man standing in front of her. He was a man who could be called a bit cocky, but she didn't think. A moment later, the prince gave his little sister a great fright. Already sitting in the prince's arms, the girl wanted to address him and called him Your Highness Zed. The young man in response asked why she called him Highness. The prince smiled broadly and said that he thought she should call him something else. He said that she was his little sister. Then he yawned widely and said that his name should be Big Brother Zed. And then Chloe didn't wait long. She wasn't going to be coaxed, so she said. The young man's eyes sparkled. He laughed loudly and said that the girl could not understand why the prince was so pleased that she called him her elder brother. The princess thought that her middle brother was so excited about such ordinary things. And at the same time, she closed her eyes and listened to the loud pounding in her chest, hoping that things would get better soon. And while her older brother carried her in his arms through the dark corridor, she began to recall the names of people who had become dear to her. Prince Chester, Colin, Philippe, and her brother Zed, whom she had just met, and even Theo. When she said the word Theo, she immediately perked up. She had completely forgotten that the princess thought that she absolutely had to visit the former little slave. She grabbed her brother's coat with her hand, tugged at it, and told him to let her go. When the prince asked her what had happened, the girl told him that she needed to meet her friend. The young man was surprised by the girl's desire to see her friend in the middle of the night. He touched the end of his little sister's nose with his index finger and said that she must not. The girl became upset and began to whine quietly. She did not want to sleep at all and needed to see Theo. The young man was not affected at all. He continued to carry her towards the princess's chambers and said that she might not be a baby, but she was still a child. There was a dark corridor ahead of them, but the girl was not afraid now. And the prince said that now she needed to sleep, and tomorrow. The princess agreed with her brother's words and thought that Theo was probably sleeping now, and it would be very polite to wake him up in the middle of the night. She thought again of her little friend's face and wondered if he would be angry if she woke him up. Because when her brother brought her to the very door of the room in which her bedroom was located, the girl thought for some reason that in reality she was not quite a good person. The prince pulled the door handle, which creaked slightly again. When the princess and her older brother entered the room, they were surprised to notice that there was a man crawling on all fours near the princess's bed, as if he had lost something. The prince looked in surprise at the man who had appeared out of nowhere and was doing something incomprehensible, and the girl loudly called him by his name, Colin. The knight in question immediately jumped up as if he had been scalded with boiling water. He loudly shouted the princess's name. Then the young man walked quickly towards the prince and princess and asked the girl where she had been all this time. The knight approached the prince and stopped. He silently began to look into the eyes of the young man, who for now remained completely silent. Zed pressed his little sister's head to his cheek and smiled sweetly. And the knight asked him why he brought the princess here. The prince replied that he had met her right at the entrance, and since she was unaccompanied in the dark corridor of the palace, he had no choice but to. Then he told the knight that news had reached him that the child was his sister. At this time, the prince kept glancing with his sparkling eyes at the young man standing in front of him, who wondered if the prince. Zed touched the girl's nose with his finger again and asked the young man if he didn't think the princess would be charming when she grew up. She would certainly be famous, and not only in high circles. Colin said that it would certainly be so after the prince's words that if all her suitors. The young man thought the princess was very nice, but he thought it was a bit early to say that. He was worried about something else. Chloe realized that she had probably let her friend down with her actions. She sighed heavily and began searching for an answer. Colin seemed very upset by her actions and words. He said she shouldn't ask for forgiveness, and But he was not allowed to finish the sentence by the prince, who said that they had correctly observed. This was not something for which the princess should apologize, and in general, the princess should never apologize to anyone. Zed continued and said, however, this is a different case. If the princess's personal knight who left his post instead of being on guard for her sleep. The prince's eyes changed. An evil and insidious gleam appeared in them, and he said that the knight had failed in his duties, and it was he who would beg for forgiveness. The poor young man who realized his mistake felt goosebumps. He became afraid, because with his Colin thought that even if the crown prince had called him, he would not have been allowed to leave his post. He now understood what would have happened. The knight immediately knelt before the prince and princess and bowed low. Kneeling before them, the knight asked the little princess for forgiveness and said that it was his mistake. Chloe was simply in shock from everything that was happening. It seemed that she realized, but tears began to flow from the little girl's eyes, and she began to explain to the prince that she had intended to, but the prince was adamant. The young man pointed his finger at the princess sitting in his arms. Zed then told the girl that she was lucky to meet him in a dark corridor today. The prince then said that it was unclear what the girl would do if she met the monsters living here, and headed towards the girl's bed, saying that it was time for the baby to go to bed. He put the girl in her comfortable bed, covered her with a blanket, and said that it was high time for her to sleep. The prince waved his hand, and without turning to the princess's wanderer, told him that he was still upset by all these events. Colin nodded his head and said that he would carry out the prince's order. He walked towards the door and disappeared behind it. As it seemed to the girl, he looked very sad. The little princess was sad just like that. She hugged the little toy to her chest and thought that she shouldn't have gone. Chloe lay down and wondered if her boyfriend would hate her for setting him up like that. She wondered if she could do anything to change that. The prince also seemed to be about to leave. His face had changed and he no longer looked so cheerful. But then, apparently changing his mind, he turned around and, cheerfully addressing his little sister, asked her if she would like to listen to a story. Past was a completely new word to her. She had never heard it before, so she said it out loud once more. It seemed that her older brother had no intention of leaving at all. He sat down next to his sister's bed, and the young man began his story. He told that not long ago there lived. Perhaps there was an explanation for this man's bad character, because the prince was cursed to die in the arms of his loved one. Zed continued his story. He said that the prince was not the only victim of the curse. Due to mistakes made in the past, all of the prince's descendants were doomed to suffer greatly from this curse. The girl listened attentively to her brother's story. She was interested, but at the same time it seemed she began to feel sleepy, and she began to snore quietly. From an early age, princes were taught one single and indisputable rule. It sounded like this: never give your heart to anyone. Due to an evil curse, they could not trust even their own blood relatives. Because no matter how far apart you become, they will ultimately be the ones who can break down the walls that surround your heart. That is why the members of the imperial family of Ascania rarely see each other. One of the brothers spends most of his time in the palace. Another wanders and travels somewhere beyond its borders, but then, at least, the third one has long been forgotten because it seems he has no intention of returning to his relatives and is somewhere on the edge of the empire. It even got to the point that anyone who claims the throne is obliged to pierce his own father with a dagger. This custom is frowned upon by society and considered immoral, but for the family to prove that even the man who gave them life is not allowed to enter their hearts, the one who claims the throne, the prince would have continued his story if he had not heard. The princess was almost asleep, but her eyes, which were red at that time, showed that she still heard everything. The girl said that, in her opinion, they were very sad. The prince seemed surprised by her words. He leaned over her head and asked why. When he asked the princess whether she felt sad for the man who might be stabbed or for the man who might kill, the girl replied that she felt sad for both. She said that they must have been very unhappy. They had to show how much they hated each other. And this sadness probably proved their love. Zed said that was a very true thought. It would be He stroked his little sister and said that unfortunately there was nothing to be done about it. The young man said that a good example of this were those few princes who fell in love. Unfortunately, they ended badly, and it would have been easy. The curse is death at the hands of a loved one. The right to love someone. As a result, the person in love feels completely devastated when his love is taken away from him. The most callous and cold-blooded curse in existence. The damned thus. The prince told his sister that there were never empresses with emperors because then there would be a gap in the defense they had created. He continued and said that if you only pretend to love other people, then maybe there will be. The princess seemed to wake up. She became very interested in this story. The prince said that it doesn't matter how much a person tries to hide their emotions. A person's eyes reflect everything. When a person is overcome by anger, it immediately becomes noticeable by the color of his eyes. When sadness takes hold of you, it colors your eyes bright red. Delight in the soul, as on a clear day, the eyes will be colored lilac. When the soul is troubled, the eyes will take on a green color. The prince told the girl that he would continue his story. He said that not long ago, their country was ruled by an emperor who found himself. This man also knew about the curse that had befallen their family. And so, like other emperors, he kept his distance from people. This man tried not to love anyone, but all stories begin with something unusual. That's exactly how the story of the man he's about to tell his sister about began. One day, this emperor was impressed by a woman he met. She wounded him to the very heart, and he realized that he could not resist her charms. This woman simply captured his lonely heart with her charm, strangely wanting to be loved, and also the prince touched his little sister's forehead with his finger and said that, of course, the emperor could not resist his feeling. The monster, who had been sitting in a cave without a single ray of light, now. Zed continued his story. He told that the emperor did not mind at all if he died one day in the arms of his beloved. So he decided to love her, despite any curses. But that beautiful lady knew what was in the emperor's head. It was love, full of sorrow. The result of the love between the emperor and this woman was Chloe. But unfortunately, the problem was, the prince knew what happened next. The emperor and his lady began to drift apart, but he thought he didn't want to tell the little child that. Finally, the young man laughed and said that the most important thing was that the proof of the love between these two people was a child. Chester, Zed, and Ezra are children born not out of love. It was the emperor's duty. He had to conceive these children, and all the nobility adhered to it. It was merely a political necessity. The mothers had no interest in the children they bore, since the birth of a child did not confer the right. But Chloe was different. Until her last breath, Chloe's mother begged for her child to live safely. She asked for this even when she knew that childbirth would be fatal for her. The prince told his little sister that she had become a child born of love. The girl closed her eyes and began to snore softly in her bed as the prince finished his story by telling her that she didn't have to worry about. The young man smiled and said that when he was told that he had a younger sister, he became curious. But it turned out that she was not at all what he imagined. He wished his little sister good night and said that the fact that she turned out to be completely different made him like her even more. With tenderness in his eyes, he looked at the sleeping girl and asked the little child not to worry about anything. He took her hand in his and squeezed it lightly. The girl responded with an equally light handshake. Such a sweet-looking prince, Brother Z, said that he would kill anyone who wished evil on his sweet little sister. After all, since ancient, the morning caught the little princess quite unexpectedly. It seemed that the night had flown by unnoticed, and when she woke up, she stood up in her crib and thought. The girl recalled the details of the story she had heard yesterday and realized that it was a sad story about how she was still haunted by what she had learned from her brother yesterday. She doubted that it was just some. Chloe thought that if, as Zed said, the Emperor had to kill his father, then perhaps her older brother would. The girl didn't want this, and so she hoped that it would certainly not affect His Highness the Prince of Chester. Chloe thought it must be just an old story her brother had decided to tell her at night. And maybe it was the same joke as when he squeezed her cheeks. The princess thought that she should tell her brother not to do that again next time. It was with this thought that, as always, she had her little toy in her hands, and looking at it, she again remembered something important. The princess threw the puppy into the air and remembered that Prince Chester had not yet given a name to her toy. After all, he had bestowed the name. She pressed the toy to her face, asked its forgiveness for her forgetfulness, and said that she would try to. At that moment, someone knocked on the front door and addressed the princess. Chloe smiled happily and exclaimed loudly, allowing entry into her chambers. When the door opened, new inhabitants of the palace appeared before her. In front stood a stern-looking woman in glasses, and behind her lined. Chloe was very surprised by the appearance of strangers here. She wondered who these people were, but then the princess calmed down when she saw that behind the woman and the girls were her loyal guard and the senior chamberlain. Chloe was very happy when the knight approached her, smiled as if nothing had happened, and wished her good morning. She decided that everything seemed to be fine with Colin, and she had worried about yesterday for nothing. When she turned towards the woman, she was a little scared. She glared sternly at her and seemed to be not. The little princess's faithful guard approached her, bowed to her, and asked the girl how. Chloe took her time with her answer. She kept looking back at the woman who seemed very strict. Then the head valet approached the princess. He greeted her and said that, as he had already told the princess yesterday, he now wanted to introduce her. The maids began introducing themselves to their young mistress one by one. The second was a girl with hair of a very unusual color. She bowed to the princess and said that her name was Jessie Wells. Then the other princess maids who came into the room began to introduce themselves one by one. Each of them said her name and spoke about how pleased she was to become. Finally, it was the turn of the oldest woman to introduce herself. She bowed low to the princess, and Chloe noticed that unlike the other maids who had introduced themselves to her, this woman. Chloe almost cried because the woman seemed to be looking at her sideways and looked angry. Colin also noticed the change in his mistress's mood. He wanted to rush to the little girl right away. But the maid blocked his way with her hand. After she stopped the knight, Linda approached the little princess, smiled at her, and spoke to her. The woman said that Chloe was very upset. It seemed that everything was going exactly as she thought. The chambermaid continued without smiling and said that this might be extremely presumptuous of her for the first day. Chloe listened carefully to this woman and understood that most likely she made. Unlike the other people in the palace, who were very kind to the princess and treated her with the utmost politeness and friendliness, this woman looked dry and angry. Chloe was forced to listen to her tell her that the princess was a noble girl. Standing in front of the little girl, the maid told her that, after all, the only people. The woman did not stop talking. She continued to firmly teach the prince. She assured the princess that there would be many who would want to take advantage of her naivety for their own selfish. Disrespect on the part of the maids must be prevented in every possible way. As soon as anything like this becomes known, it must be reported. It may also happen that gossip in high circles will not take long to appear. Chloe even flinched when the woman told her that it would not be easy for the little princess to understand now, but she would be very grateful if she thought about her words. After thinking about the maid's words, the girl thought that she had been very wrong about this woman. It seemed to her that she was much kinder than it might have seemed at first, and Chloe didn't even notice how she said out loud her thoughts about what Lynn meant, and didn't hate her, or then she realized what was being said and shouted loudly that, of course not. She did not hate. Chloe immediately smiled, laughed loudly, and told the maid that it was a great relief for her. The princess decided that she still had a lot to learn, so she would learn from this apparently good woman. That way, no one would hate her. Chloe thought that it was for this very reason that she was going to study even harder. To be ready, the princess bowed to the maid and asked her to take care of her. Linda smiled and sighed. She thought that the princess was acting exactly as she said. She shouldn't be so kind. She also thought that the maid bowed to the princess, and an important thought came to her mind that, while etiquette was important, it was much more difficult to have a strong character. Apparently, this child was different from all the others she had seen. When the introduction ceremony was over, the new maids helped the little princess dress, and she went to the dining room, where, sitting down on her chair, she began to look around. Chloe was disappointed to find herself the only one sitting at the dinner table in this place. When the maid approached her, the girl asked her if she knew what was going on. Linda told her that His Highness the Crown Prince was unable to share a meal with his little sister today. The woman said the young man apologized for not being able to attend the breakfast due to a huge amount of work and sent the princess a gift as an apology. One of the maids brought the princess a box containing a decoration in the shape of a sprout. The girl thought that the crown. Chloe smiled and thought that she was lucky to have a brother, even if he was a little strange. She decided to do this with his gift, placing it next to the sprout that His Majesty the Emperor had sent. The chambermaid informed the princess that she had no lessons today and asked her what she thought about it. Linda knew nothing about the princess's friend, since she had not been told anything about it. The girl thought that her little friend had probably gotten up a long time ago and was probably having breakfast now. When the maid asked her where her friend lived, the girl happily replied that her wanderer had told her that he was not far from here. Linda began to think where this unknown friend of the princess could live. Not so far from the royal estate, perhaps he is the son of some duke. Or maybe. The woman continued to think, and came to the conclusion that she did not think that there was a boy named Theo among the noble families. The chambermaid did not know what to answer the little lady. If she had been warned from the very beginning about the presence of a friend, she would have been prepared for this question. Chloe noticed that the woman's face looked so serious. She decided that perhaps her request would not be approved. Linda's eyes flashed. She leaned towards the girl and said that this was certainly not so. It was all nonsense, and asked the princess if she would like some. Looking at the amazed girl sitting opposite her, the woman thought that it was good to have a friend nearby, even with delicacy. Chloe immediately imagined herself coming to her friend with her treats, and then feeding him food that they could. The chambermaid became cheerful and said that the girl needed to eat well before the upcoming walk. And while she was eating, the woman would prepare everything necessary. Chloe immediately agreed with her. Delighted that she would be able to spoil her friend with. Linda told the princess that they had strawberry mousse, charlotte with sponge cake, and apple pudding with custard. According to the chambermaid, the chef said that these sweets should go well with any tea. When the maid showed the basket of food to the little princess, she felt that its contents emitted such a sweet, captivating aroma. The chambermaid smiled at the girl again as she handed her the basket of food and asked her to come back for dinner. To which the equally happy girl replied. At this moment, Colin came up to them. He also seemed to be in a good mood and asked the princess seemed very happy with this question. She immediately began telling her old friend about what the chef had prepared for her and who she was going to meet during the walk. Chloe had no idea what the word picnic meant, so she laughed out loud, said what it was, and the young man seemed a little sad. He wondered if everything would be all right. He knew that the situation was different now than when they were slaves. What if the boy suddenly became intoxicated? Chloe looked at her guard questioningly. She asked him if he knew where Theo was. She really wanted to go to him and meet him. She was worried that the night tears were about to appear in her eyes. Was she really not going to be able to see her friend because she couldn't? Colin laughed and said that of course she could do that. The young man noticed that the princess's eyes. The young man took the basket of goodies from the hands of the maid and said that, in his opinion, Linda turned to the princess's guard and asked him to take care of her. Colin said that it was his job. He was appointed to this position specifically to protect the little lady, and therefore there was no need to worry. The chambermaid told her little mistress to take care of herself and returned safely. The knight walked down the corridor of the palace, showing the way to the little princess who followed him. She constantly urged him on, wanting to see her. On the way, Chloe thought about what she should tell Theo. The girl hoped that he would like the delicacies that Linda and the chef had prepared. She also thought that the boy's room should be as big and cozy as hers. The princess didn't notice how someone's huge hand reached towards her neck. As if sensing danger, the girl turned around in fear to see who was about to grab her. The next moment, Chloe was grabbed by the man and began screaming loudly, demanding that he let her go. Hearing the cry of his little mistress, Colin immediately turned around, intending. Over their screams, neither the knight nor the little girl could hear the loud laughter that burst from the lips of the young man who had grabbed the girl. It was Crown Prince Zed, who, holding his little sister in his arms, said that perhaps he. When Colin addressed the man who had grabbed her by name, the girl realized that it was His Highness Zed, and he laughed loudly and greeted. The princess said to him, "Hello, Your Highness, Prince Zed." She wondered why he called her baby. The young man reminded his little sister that he had told her to call her brother, not Your Highness, or, if she so wished, she could simply call him Zed. He pinched the girl's cheek again with such force that a tear flowed from her eye, and the prince admired his little sister. He said that he loved her very much because she was also their savior. Chloe started telling her brother that she was going to meet her friend, and then saw that her basket. Colin looked very upset. He bowed to his mistress, asking her forgiveness for dropping the basket of food. The princess closed her eyes from the vexation that filled her. She really didn't want her brother to see her tears. The princess said that the knight had done nothing wrong. But the princess's elder brother had a completely different opinion. He turned to the knight and asked him how he. Colin immediately began to object and justify himself. He said that it happened because he was in a hurry to protect his mistress, and the girl added that this could not be fixed, and the knight should be given a chance to fix and make amends. The prince pressed his little sister to his chest and said that now the baby and he would go out together for a while. He added that it would be just the two of them and their vast empire, which signed a treaty with the ancient dragon, thereby receiving protection from him, has an inviolable capital. No one who wanted to harm the Ascania family was able to invade this. The people living in the capital indulged in many idle pursuits in peace and security, such as enjoying delicious food. This is what the prince said to his little sister when the prince and the girl were sitting in a small cafe, and between them stood a table on which this work of culinary art was placed. When the prince told the girl that she should try it quickly because it was one of the 3 most delicious. The prince didn't ask the girl if she liked her new dress, but she had other thoughts. The princess could not forget how disappointed Colin looked when they left him. He was still eager to accompany. His Highness Prince Zed watched with his little sister. He said that if she couldn't eat it all, she could just leave it. Chloe immediately objected. She explained that you shouldn't do that with food. If she didn't fit. The girl remembered her past life in the slave owner's house. When she was a slave, she was always punished if she did not fit. The prince thought about it and agreed with his sister. She was absolutely right. Zed said that it was really bad. The young man also said that the girl was so smart, and the prince told her that there was no need to force yourself to do something you didn't want to do. Chloe picked up her spoon and was about to start tasting the cake that had caught her attention so much. Her brother patted her on the head when Chloe told him she wanted to take the rest of the cake with her. The prince told her that she was really smart and that when she grew up, she would be the smartest girl in the world. Chloe was then distracted from eating her cake by the appearance of a girl who quickly entered the cafe and loudly addressed His Highness Prince Zed. According to Chloe, this girl looked bright and impressive. She said that vile and from the House of Hanover. When the girl said that it was an incredible coincidence, the prince only sighed heavily, propped his head up with his hand, and said that the coincidence was indeed incredible. The girl laughed and said that the prince should simply call her by her name. The little princess looked closely at the visitor who had suddenly appeared here. She was surprised by absolutely everything about her. In the palace, the young lady asked the prince who it was that had come with him. The little girl's brother asked the girl if she didn't know this yet. Zed thought how tired he was of all these hangers-on hanging around the emperor's throne. He had ordered that no other customers should be allowed in here, so that the princess would not be embarrassed, and now an uninvited, annoying guest had shown up. The young man thought that the county of Hanover had long had its eye on the imperial throne that did not belong to them. Their attraction seemed rather brazen and stupid, and now she still claimed that it was all just a coincidence. When her elder brother said that she was the only princess of the House of Ascania, Chloe Ascania, the girl greeted the girl who came and said that she was. The uninvited visitor exclaimed, "Oh my God," and declared that she was Viol from the Hanover family. Their house has served the throne faithfully for a long time. The prince listened attentively to what this girl was saying. He really wanted to Vile smiled and was kind to the little princess all the time. She said that she wanted permission to ask the princess for a favor. She said that with Her Highness's permission, it would be a benefit to her if the girl would attend a meeting that she would be organizing. The young man didn't like it at all. He thought it was quite clear why she had come here, and decided that she was a very slippery lady. He said that he was perfectly clear about the motives and goals of this girl's appearance in this place. The young man's face darkened considerably. The young man's eyes began to sparkle brightly. He came as close as possible to the uninvited guest and quietly told her to fall down and disappear from his sight as quickly as possible. Vile began to make excuses. She decided that she needed to hush up this conversation so as not to expose herself to further attack. And so she told the prince that she simply wanted to buy a couple of sweets for the tea. When the girl apologized for taking up too much of their time and asked permission to take her leave, the prince told his sister that this was precisely why he didn't like. When his little sister repeated the word fox, he explained to her that a fox had just been with them, but good children did not notice, and added that if she decided to go to the ceremony, he then explained to his sister that this girl had no good intentions. She would pretend to like the princess, plot behind her back. Chloe said that in that case, she would rather not go to a place where she would be treated like that. The girl thought that the prince was talking like that because he was worried about her. And the young man at that time became cheerful and carefree again. He told his little sister. Zed began to stroke the girl's head and told her that, if necessary, he would go with her. After that, Prince Zed and his little sister, Princess Chloe, took the rest of the cake with them and left the cafe. They finally went for a walk where her brother literally shuddered and jerked his hand after a voice was heard next to them, saying that no matter how you look at it, the prince could not boast of. Both the girl and the young man walking next to her turned in the direction from which the voice came. They saw the crown prince standing near the carriage. Chester turned to his sister and told her that he had been looking for her everywhere. He added that they had been late on their walk and that was why he had come to meet her. Then the crown prince walked up to the girl, picked her up in his arms, and looked closely at her face. Zed, who was standing next to them, told his brother that he had given him no chance. He said that he had a feeling that Chester was quick to respond. He said it was just unfounded worry. And when the crown prince and his sister got into the carriage and set off, Zed stood in the street, muttering that his hand kept reaching out to follow the carriage as it drove away into the distance. And the prince was upset that he had been. Chloe was very excited. Everything happened so quickly for her. And now she excitedly asked His Highness if the words she spoke literally cut to the soul of the crown prince. He was amazed by how easily the girl called a man she had only met yesterday brother. Chloe realized that she must have made a mistake again. Was she wrong to call him that? She just had to fix it. She watched her older brother and saw that he was very upset. The girl realized that perhaps she was the reason for such a change in his mood. Chester couldn't understand why everything happened this way. He quietly whispered only one word. Chloe didn't quite hear what her brother said. When she apologized to him and asked him what he had just said, he said nothing and told her not to worry. The young man decided to ask the girl if anything else had happened to her, and she replied that she had been invited. He began to stroke his little sister's head and said that she had an excellent memory, and it was true that she learned quickly when she replied that Vile from the Hanover house had called her to meet him. The princess replied that she did not think she had made much progress. And besides, Zed's brother had said that it would be better for her not to go to the meeting. Chester confirmed that this was indeed the case. He also did not think that anything good could come out of such a long and distant trip. When Chloe told her brother that, according to Zed, if she went, there would be many people there who would want to use her, Chester said that at the same time, the prince informed his sister that many people would be willing to serve faithfully the only princess of the Ascania family. After the girl asked him that they weren't slaves, Chester said that of course they weren't. Besides, Chester said that it all depended on her desire, and if she didn't want to go, then she didn't have to, and the girl said that she didn't want to. The princess remembered what her maid had told her. Linda had said that the girl was sure that she should not upset her father and brothers under any circumstances. With her incompetence, she could create problems and make mistakes. The Crown Prince of Chester ordered that a suitable reply to the invitation be sent. But his little sister no longer heard it. She peered at the landscape they were now passing and was surprised to notice that something had appeared there that had definitely not been there in that empty space a moment ago. It seemed to her that this tower, which she now saw before her eyes, seemed to be moving. Just a moment ago, there was nothing here, but now it appeared so suddenly. The Crown Prince of Chester continued to sit in the carriage, not paying attention to what was happening outside the window. Chloe wanted to share what she had seen with her brother and show him the tower too, but she suddenly realized that it had disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared. She wondered if she had imagined it all. Chloe peered into the forest surrounding the road to no avail. The tower she had seen was no longer there, and it was impossible to tell if it had ever